Location: Marble Mountain Wilderness Area, California. Date: October 27, 2015. The October fog rolled down from the higher elevations like something alive, swallowing the granite peaks whole and reducing visibility to perhaps 30 yards. Kevin Summers had been monitoring the weather on the station radio since dawn, watching the pressure system collapse across the northern California wilderness. Unseasonable cold was moving in behind it, the kind of cold that made bones ache and turned breath to visible ghosts within seconds. By nightfall, the overnight low would drop below 20 degrees. Already at 4 in the afternoon, frost was forming on the south-facing rocks, glittering like scattered diamonds before fading back to gray stone. He stood at the ranger station's weathered wooden porch, thermal mug of black coffee warming his palms, and surveyed the landscape that had been his responsibility for 6 seasons. Marble Mountain Wilderness stretched across 241,744 acres of remote backcountry. Jagged peaks, cirque lakes frozen solid by December, and deep valleys where sunlight seemed to give up the effort of reaching the forest floor. The nearest town was 50 miles west. The nearest ranger station besides his own was 60 miles south. In late October, his territory was nearly empty. The summer crowds had fled back to the valley towns, seeking easier trails and cell phone coverage. What remained were the hardcore hikers, the people who came to these mountains specifically because the wilderness demanded respect. The radio crackled. All stations, be advised. We've got a late hiker registered for Marble Mountain Trail System. Solo female, age 29, registered for 2-night backcountry permit. Departure date yesterday, October 26th. She's expected back at the Lovers Cove trailhead by late afternoon today, October 27th. Owner of a 2008 Subaru, California plate Baker Charlie 5372, is reporting the vehicle still in the parking area. Last location check with dispatch was this morning at 0800 hours. Kevin lowered his coffee. It was already past 4 o'clock. If she'd planned to return by late afternoon and her car was still sitting in the lot, the timeline was becoming uncomfortable. He keyed the radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 3 at Marble Mountain Station. I'll head to the trailhead and check for any recent sign, requesting hiker's name and physical description. The response came back promptly. Unit 3, registered hiker is Sophia Chen, female, age 29, Asian descent, approximately 5'4", brown eyes, black hair, experienced hiker. Permit shows 5 years of backcountry experience in California, Oregon, and Washington. Vehicle registered to her address in Redding. Recommend attempted callback at the emergency contact number we have on file. Kevin set down his mug and grabbed his jacket from inside the station. A weathered green ranger uniform jacket with faded patches, lined with fleece. The evening was turning cold faster than the forecast had suggested. As he pulled on the jacket, he ran through the mental checklist that had become automatic after 6 years. Flashlight with fresh batteries, charged radio with the frequency already set, knife on his belt, headlamp in the pack, emergency blanket, basic first aid. The autumn trails could be treacherous even without weather complications. Leaves obscured drop-offs. Rocks turned slick with frost overnight. The drive to Lovers Cove trailhead took 40 minutes on the winding mountain road. Kevin knew every curve, every pothole, every turnout where winter snow would eventually make the route impassable. The fog thickened as he climbed higher, pressing against the windshield until the world beyond the hood of his truck became just diffuse gray. Radio signals were weakening, normal for the elevation and weather. He heard dispatch attempting to reach other units, voices fragmenting and cracking with interference. The Lovers Cove parking area was nearly empty, 6 spots, all unmarked except for Sophia Chen's Subaru. The car sat in the second space from the road, facing out toward the valley below, which was now completely obscured by fog. Kevin parked beside it and approached on foot, noting immediately that the vehicle had been here for at least 24 hours. Frost coated the windshield. The driver's side window was cracked open by about an inch, which meant someone had deliberately left it that way to prevent glass fogging. Standard practice for leaving a car unattended in autumn weather. He looked at the parking area. One vehicle, no other hikers visible. The trailhead bulletin board showed the day's date and offered warnings about the incoming weather system and early snow at elevations above 9,000 feet. Below the official notices, someone had carved into the wooden frame, "Do not go past Marble Peak after dark." The carving looked old, the letters darkened with years of weather exposure, but the message was clear. Kevin tried the radio. "Dispatch, Unit 3. I'm at the Lover's Cove trailhead. Vehicle is present and consistent with the description. No visual sign of the hiker. Fog is now at approximately 100%. Visibility near zero. I'm going to attempt a search of the trail corridor with emphasis on the first mile. Requesting backup if available." Static bloomed, then fragmented. "Unit 3. Copy on vehicle. No units. Available. Weather. All personnel. Contingency protocols. Contact you 30 minutes. Dispatch, I didn't copy that. Say again." More static. Then nothing except the soft rush of wind through the pines and the distant, constant whisper of fog against the mountain. Kevin keyed the radio once more. "Dispatch, Unit 3 attempting search. Will advise." The trail entrance was marked with a weathered wooden sign showing mileage. Marble Peak, 4.2 miles. Lover's Cove Lake, 6.1 miles. Paradise Valley, 9.8 miles. All three destinations were high-elevation destinations. The most likely scenario was that Sophia had gotten a late start yesterday, camped on the trail, and overslept this morning. The fog made hiking slow and dangerous. She could simply be moving carefully down the mountain in low visibility, unaware that she was now several hours behind her planned return time. The trail immediately disappeared into dense forest. Douglas fir, white pine, and scattered whitebark pines that had begun their slow decline from high-altitude drought. The fog was so thick that Kevin's flashlight beam seemed to stop about 8 feet ahead, as if the light was being absorbed by something rather than reflected back. He moved carefully, watching for recent boot prints, disturbed vegetation, anything that would confirm that Sophia had come this way. The forest smelled of autumn, decay, moisture, the mineral scent of stone and frost. But underneath that, something else. Something faint that made Kevin's hindbrain register an alert that his conscious mind wasn't ready to acknowledge. The smell of something old, something that had been in the forest for a very long time. He walked for perhaps a quarter mile, moving slowly. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked with old white blazes. He saw a few recent boot prints in the soft earth, consistent with a hiking shoe, size small, depth indicating someone relatively light. Sophia's prints, probably. The prints were there on the way up the trail. He photographed them with his phone, evidence that she had indeed started the hike. Then the prints simply stopped. Kevin stood where the last visible print ended, looking ahead at the trail that continued, unmarked by any recent foot traffic. He looked back. The prints disappeared approximately 1.3 miles from the trailhead, according to his GPS. The GPS also showed him the trail continued another 200 yards before switchbacking up the next incline. But here, where the trail straightened through a flat section of dense forest, the evidence of Sophia Chen's passage simply ceased. Kevin looked left and right. The forest here was dense, but not impenetrably so. No major brush barriers. No obvious reason someone would leave the established trail. He called out, "Hello? Park Service? Is anyone out here? Sophia?" His voice seemed to be absorbed by the fog. No echo. No response. He keyed the radio again, the transmission crackling immediately with static. "Dispatch, I've got something. Last sign of the hiker approximately 1.3 miles up the Lover's Cove trail. Boot prints end abruptly in the middle of the trail corridor. No apparent deviation from the marked route. I'm going to do a grid search of the immediate area." The response came back broken. 3. Copy. Proceed with caution. Weather deteriorating. Kevin turned on his headlamp in addition to the flashlight, creating a pool of doubled light that still seemed inadequate against the fog. He began a systematic search pattern, moving in widening circles from the point where the prints had ended. The forest here was mostly open, with thick ground cover and scattered fallen logs. Easy walking, for the most part. Easy place to spot someone who had strayed off trail or become injured. He found nothing. No backpack, no blood, no torn clothing, no body. What he did find, after perhaps 30 minutes of searching, was something stranger. A rock formation. 3 boulders stacked roughly on top of each other, perhaps 7 feet tall, that seemed to have been deliberately assembled. It wasn't natural. The rocks were positioned too precisely, the smaller stone balanced on top of the 2 larger ones in a way that would take intention and effort. Kevin had been hiking these mountains for 6 years and had never seen this formation before. At the base of the stacked rocks, he found a single hiking boot. The boot was oriented perfectly, placed carefully, not dropped or lost in a struggle. It was a woman's size 7 Merrill hiking boot, mud-caked from recent use, the laces still tied. Kevin knelt and examined it without touching. The boot was here. Sophia's boot must be, but the owner of the boot was not. He looked around the immediate area, searching for anything else. The other boot, a trail of disturbed earth, anything that would suggest where the rest of her might be. The forest had swallowed her. The radio crackled urgently. Unit 3, dispatch, respond. Kevin grabbed the radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 3. I've located evidence. 1 hiking boot, confirmed to match the description of the hiker's footwear. Location approximately 1.4 miles up the Lover's Cove Trail from Trailhead. I'm marking the location with GPS coordinates now, requesting immediate backup and expanded search parameters. This is now a missing person situation. The response took longer this time. When it came, the voice sounded distant, not just from signal degradation, but as if speaking from very far away. Unit 3, copy on missing person. We are implementing SAR protocol. Nearest available unit is 45 minutes from your location. Remain at scene and maintain order of the evidence. Do not disturb the boot. Await backup. Kevin acknowledged and sat down on a fallen log near the stacked rocks. His flashlight beam pointed at the single abandoned boot. The forest around him was absolutely silent. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just the soft sound of his own breathing and the occasional crackle of static from the radio on his belt. He was still sitting there, watching the boot, when he heard the voice calling from somewhere deeper in the fog. Kevin. It wasn't dispatch. It wasn't anyone on the radio. It was a human voice, clear and distinct, calling his name from somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees. A voice he recognized, which made no sense because the person who owned that voice had no reason to be in the Marble Mountain wilderness on this particular evening. It was his brother, Michael. Michael, who lived in Los Angeles. Michael, who had last spoken to Kevin 3 days ago over the phone, confirming Thanksgiving plans. Michael, whose voice was somehow coming from the fog-shrouded forest like an invitation. Kevin, you need to come find me. I'm lost. Kevin stood, his hand instinctively moving to the radio, then stopping. What was he going to say? That he was hearing his brother's voice in the woods? That dispatch would believe? He knew better. He knew the mountains well enough to understand that sound behaves strangely in fog and cold air. Sound could carry for miles. Voices could travel in unexpected directions, bouncing off stone and through dense forest. But Michael's voice was coming from deeper in the wilderness. It was coming from the direction Sophia had gone. Kevin picked up the boot, protocol be damned, and secured it in his pack. He marked the coordinates carefully on his GPS and began walking deeper into the forest, following the direction of the voice that kept calling his name. Arar. What Kevin couldn't hear, what no radio could capture, was happening to Sophia Chen 6 miles away in the high country above Paradise Valley. She had been walking for 18 hours straight, though her mind insisted it had only been 4. Time felt strange in the fog. Her feet moved on their own, following a path that she didn't remember taking. The trail she had planned to follow, the Lover's Cove Trail that would eventually loop back to the parking area, had somehow inverted itself into something else entirely. The first sign that something was wrong had come yesterday afternoon, just as she was approaching Paradise Valley Lake. The lake was supposed to be her destination for the night, a high alpine cirque lake surrounded by granite walls, accessible by a well-maintained trail. She had consulted her map obsessively throughout the day, comparing the terrain to the topographic lines. Everything had matched perfectly until she arrived at what should have been the lake. It wasn't. Instead, she found herself in a valley that didn't exist on her map. The valley was real enough. There was a lake, certainly, though it was wrong somehow. The water was dark, too dark, reflecting the fog-covered sky in a way that made it impossible to tell where water ended and air began. The stone walls surrounding it were smooth and black, volcanic in nature, nothing like the pale granite she had expected. Sophia had checked her GPS. The coordinates made sense. According to the device, she was where she should be. But the landscape disagreed fundamentally with that assessment. She had spent the night in that valley, sleeping fitfully in her tent, listening to sounds that she couldn't quite identify. Not animals, something else. Something that seemed to walk around her tent at intervals throughout the night, circling, never approaching too close, never going away. When she had finally emerged from her tent at dawn, exhausted and uneasy, she had discovered that everything had changed again. The valley was gone. The black lake had vanished. The stone walls had been replaced by dense forest. Sophia was in a place that she didn't recognize, holding a map that no longer seemed to correspond to the world around her, and she had no idea where she was. The panic had come in waves, then receded, then come again. She was an experienced hiker. She knew the protocols: stay put, make yourself visible, keep your whistle handy. Her whistle had been in her pack. She had blown it, 3 long blasts, the universal distress signal, and listened for the echo. There was no echo. The forest had absorbed the sound completely, as if her distress signal had been carried away and deliberately silenced. After that, Sophia had made the choice to walk. Staying put might be the right decision in a normal emergency, but the forest around her didn't feel normal. It felt active. It felt aware. Every rustle, every shift in the fog seemed purposeful and directed toward her specifically. Staying put meant remaining stationary while something moved around her unseen. Walking, at least, was doing something. She had taken off one of her boots to help mark her trail and placed it deliberately on a stone formation that seemed significant. A stack of rocks that looked almost like a marker for something. A signal. She didn't remember building that formation, but she had been moving half awake through the forest for hours. Memory felt unreliable. Reality felt negotiable. For hours after that, she had walked through forest that seemed to repeat itself. The same tree would appear twice in different clearings. The same cluster of stones marked the boundary of the same stretch of trail, looping back on itself. She would navigate to what she was certain was a clearing, only to find herself walking back into the same exact stretch of forest she had just exited. And then, as the afternoon had begun to fade, she had started hearing the voice. It was calling her name. Sophia. 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 But not just a single voice. It sounded like multiple voices, all speaking in unison, all perfectly synchronized, all saying her name with a kind of hunger that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow. The voices had become clearer as the hours had passed. Now, in what felt like early evening, though she had completely lost track of time, she could make out that they were using language. Not English. Something older. Something with a shape to it that her mouth wouldn't be capable of producing, even if she tried. Sophia sat with her back against a large pine tree, her single remaining boot pressing into the soft earth beneath her, and listened to the voices circling through the fog. They were close now, very close. She could hear them moving through the brush, could hear what sounded like feathers rustling, could sense the displacement of air around her. They were calling her name. She pulled her knees up to her chest and made herself small, pressed against the ancient wood of the pine tree. The bark dug into her back. Her breath came in small, controlled gasps. She had read once that predators respond to fear. She had read that you should appear larger, more threatening, when facing something dangerous. But the thing about these voices was that they already knew she was afraid. They had been cultivating her fear for 18 hours. Fear was the only thing keeping her alive, and she suspected that on the other side of this fear was a fate worse than anything she could currently imagine. A shape moved through the fog to her left. Not human, not quite animal. It was too tall, with limbs that bent at angles that no creature she knew should bend at. Its silhouette seemed to flicker when she tried to focus on it, as if it existed partially in a different light spectrum. When it turned toward her, she saw what might have been eyes. Enormous, unblinking, luminous in the gathering dark. The shape made a sound, a ululation, a sound like wind moving through a cave, like the call of an enormous owl, like a woman's scream reversed and played at an impossible pitch. When it opened what might have been a mouth, Sophia saw inside, and what she saw was a darkness so complete that her mind refused to process it. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted her mother. She wanted anything except what was happening in this moment, this terrible moment where the fog was parting like a curtain and revealing something that had been waiting for her since she entered the forest. More shapes emerged from the fog. 3 of them. 4. Sophia stopped counting when she realized they had no definite number. They seemed to multiply the longer she looked at them. Or perhaps there had always been this many, and her perception simply couldn't hold them all in focus at once. They circled her. They waited. And Sophia, pressed against the bark of the pine tree, realized that they had been herding her toward this exact spot the entire time she had been in the forest. Everything had been leading here. The valley that didn't exist, the loop of forest that repeated, the voices calling her name. It had all been a slow dance toward this moment, this inevitable confrontation with something that existed in the old places of the world, in the cracks between civilization and true wilderness. One of the shapes reached toward her with what might have been a wing. One of them opened its mouth and made a sound that was almost, but not quite, like her own voice. They were trying to mimic her, learning her frequency, learning how to call to her, so that when they were done with Sophia Chen, they could use her voice to call others deeper into the mountains. Sophia closed her eyes and waited. Kevin was lost, but he didn't fully realize it yet. He had been following the sound of Michael's voice for almost 2 hours, and the voice had led him deeper and deeper into terrain that didn't match any of the official trail systems. The fog had grown so thick that his headlamp and flashlight were now nearly useless. They simply illuminated about 5 feet of opaque gray, beyond which was nothing. The voice called from deeper in, always just at the edge of hearing. Michael's voice. Definitely. But something was wrong with the inflection. It would say Kevin's name correctly, but then the emphasis would be slightly off. The pauses in the wrong places. It was like someone had recorded Michael speaking and then played it back at a fractionally different speed. Kevin's radio had stopped working somewhere around the time he had started following the voice. The last transmission he'd received before the static took over was fragmented. Unit 3, we have SAR teams, standing by, location, repeat, location. He wasn't sure where he was anymore. His GPS still worked, but it seemed to be displaying impossible information. According to the device, he was walking in a straight line directly south of the trailhead, but his compass disagreed. It spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north, as if the Earth's field was distorted in this particular patch of wilderness. The temperature had dropped precipitously. Kevin could see his breath now, bright crystalline clouds in the beam of his headlamp. His fingers were numb. The fog had become almost solid, pressing against him like a living thing, carrying with it that old smell he had noticed before. The smell of something ancient, something that had been waiting in these mountains since before the name California existed. Michael's voice came again, clearer this time. Kevin, you're so close, just a little farther, I can see you. Come see me. Come see what I've become. Kevin stopped walking. He looked around at the fog, at the indistinct shapes of trees that might or might not be trees, at the absolute absence of any landmark that could orient him. He reached for the radio and was not surprised to find that it was no longer on his belt. He had no memory of dropping it, but it was gone. Without the radio, he was completely isolated. He was still standing there trying to process the implications of that realization when he heard something other than Michael's voice. It was a sound like wind moving through a canyon, like the call of a great owl, like a woman screaming in a place where screams went to die. The sound came from multiple directions simultaneously, which was impossible. But then again, everything had been impossible since he left the trailhead. Kevin realized in that moment exactly what had happened to Sophia Chen. She hadn't gotten lost on the trail. She hadn't wandered off the marked path and fallen. The mountains hadn't claimed her through any natural cause. Something had taken her, something intelligent and patient and cruel, something that understood how to use the isolation of these peaks to separate people from the world, and how to use a person's own connections, family, love, concern, as a lure. He looked down at the hiking boot he had been carrying in his pack since he had found it at the rock formation. He had somehow forgotten about it. Now he pulled it out and looked at it in the beam of his headlamp. The boot was real. Sophia Chen's boot was real. But Sophia Chen herself was no longer available to claim it. The shapes emerged from the fog. They were enormous, with wings that seemed to exist partially outside the visible spectrum, with heads that were too large and eyes that reflected his headlamp light like 1,000 points of luminescence. They moved with a predatory grace that suggested they had been hunting in these mountains since long before there were rangers to protect them, since long before there were trails marked for human hikers, since long before the Yakama people had warned travelers about the Tataklea, the owl women who lived in the high places and fed on solitary travelers. Kevin understood as the nearest one reached toward him with a limb that was neither exactly a wing nor exactly an arm, that the boot in his hand was not evidence. It was an invitation. It was a message that said, "You have entered our domain, you have followed the calls that we sent you, and now you belong to us, just as your brother belonged to us, just as Sophia belongs to us, just as all the others who have ever gone missing in these mountains belong to us." Michael's voice came one final time, and now it wasn't Michael's voice at all. It was a chorus of voices, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all saying Kevin's name in perfect unison. All the voices of all the hikers who had ever disappeared in the Marble Mountain wilderness. All the voices preserved, stored, imitated perfectly. Kevin dropped the boot and tried to run. The fog swallowed him immediately. He could no longer see his headlamp's beam. He could no longer see his own hands in front of his face. He could only hear the sound of his own footsteps on the earth, and underneath that, the sound of things moving. Many things, all moving toward the same place he was moving toward. When the trees opened up into what felt like a clearing, Kevin understood that he had arrived at the place where Sophia was waiting. He could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow, pressed against something solid. He could hear the sound of feathers, so many feathers all moving at once. He tried to call out to Sophia, to say something that might constitute a final moment of human connection, before whatever happened next happened, but his mouth wouldn't cooperate. His throat had closed. All he could produce was a sound like wind moving through a canyon, like the cry of an enormous owl, like his own voice transformed into something other. The transformation, when it came, was not painful. It was merely inevitable. Like water flowing downhill, like autumn following summer, like the turning of the seasons that no human agency could prevent. Kevin felt himself changing, his perspective shifting, his senses recalibrating to perceive a world that humans were never meant to see. Around him in a circle stood other figures. Some of them were relatively fresh, still maintaining something of human shape, though the shape was wrong in multiple dimensions. Some of them were ancient, worn down to their essential predatory form, all wing and hunger and the terrible patience of things that lived for centuries. One of them had Michael's face. One of them had Sarah Martinez's face, a hiker who had disappeared in 2003. One of them had James Whitfield's face, missing since 1997. Kevin counted 17 faces before his ability to count things in the human way began to dissolve, and then, from deep in the fog, he heard the voice of dispatch calling his name, calling him back to a world he could no longer reach, to a place where he had existed only hours before but which now seemed as distant as a childhood memory. The search and rescue teams arrived at the Lover's Cove trailhead just after midnight. They found Kevin's truck parked beside Sophia Chen's Subaru. The ranger station was dark. No sign of Unit 3. The search perimeter was expanded immediately to include the full trail system and surrounding backcountry. 48 hours later, with nearly 60 searchers working the terrain, they had found Kevin's radio at a location 2.3 miles up the Lover's Cove Trail. Its battery dead. Its final transmission received by dispatch at 8:47 p.m. the previous evening. They found Sophia Chen's other boot, the one Kevin had discovered, carefully preserved in the station's evidence locker, marked with coordinates and a date, waiting to be processed. They found no bodies, no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened to either hiker. The official report concluded that both Kevin Summers and Sophia Chen had become disoriented in the fog and unseasonably poor weather, that they had likely left the marked trail system and become lost in terrain that claimed the lives of experienced hikers with depressing regularity. The case was classified as a missing persons incident with probability of fatal accident. Search and rescue operations continued for 2 weeks and then were suspended. The Marble Mountain Wilderness was returned to the Park Service's standard patrol schedule. Winter storms moved in early that year, and by November, the high country was buried under 3 feet of snow, making further search efforts impossible. In January of the following year, a new ranger was assigned to the Marble Mountain Station. His name was David Martinez, and he had no connection to Marble Mountain beyond the rotation schedule that assigned him to the station. He was a competent ranger, well-trained, experienced in remote wilderness operations. On his 3rd week at the station, David began hearing voices on the radio frequency during his evening patrols. Voices that didn't belong to dispatch. Voices that called his name in a way that made his chest tight and his hands cold. One of the voices sounded like his sister Sarah, who had gone missing from these mountains in 2003. David reported the phenomenon to his supervisor, who suggested that perhaps the radio was experiencing some kind of malfunction. Or perhaps, the supervisor speculated, David was stressed from the transition to a new station and could benefit from a few days off. David accepted the suggestion and took a long weekend in the valley town. When he returned, the voices were still there, and on the evening of his 5th day back on duty, David Martinez took his patrol radio and his hiking pack and followed the voice of his sister deeper into the fog-shrouded wilderness, toward the place where the old things were waiting, toward the place where Kevin and Sophia and Michael and 17 others had become additions to a collection that had been assembling itself for centuries, one hiker at a time, one voice at a time, growing and learning and becoming more perfect at the act of luring humans deeper into the mountains. The Marble Mountain Wilderness had finally learned to speak in human tongues. It had learned to imitate not just voices, but the emotional weight behind the voices. It had learned that the deepest hungers, the need for family, the pull of connection, the desperate human hope that a lost loved one might somehow be out there, waiting to be found, were far more effective lures than any physical trap could ever be. And so it waited in the fog, the Tataklea, the owl women, the things that had lived in this place since before language existed. It waited for the next hiker, the next solitary person drawn to the mountains by the beauty of wilderness and the seductive promise of solitude. It waited with the patience of something that had centuries to perfect its hunting technique. It called from the fog. It imitated the voices of the dead. It gathered them one by one, season by season, year by year, building a chorus that grew more sophisticated and more hungry with each edition. And in the valley below, in the ranger station that sat silent through the cold night, the radio on the desk crackled softly with a voice that wasn't quite dispatch, calling out to anyone who might be listening, speaking in English that was almost perfect, inviting new rangers to come deeper into the mountains, to answer just one more call, to follow just one more voice into the fog. The Marble Mountain Wilderness had finally learned to hunt in the language of men. Location: Honey Hole Canyon National Monument, Arizona. Date: August 14, 2015. The heat of the Arizona high desert in August was a living thing. It didn't just surround you, it infiltrated, claimed you, made you question whether your body was even yours anymore. Tyler Reeves had been the primary ranger at Honey Hole Canyon National Monument for 4 years, and he'd learned to respect the heat the way you respected a dangerous animal. You didn't fight it. You worked with it, understood its patterns, and made sure you were inside before it became truly lethal. This morning had started like most August mornings. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue that would deepen as the day progressed. The monsoon season in Arizona meant thunderstorms in the afternoon, usually violent, always brief, and absolutely unpredictable in where they'd strike. The weather radio on Tyler's desk at the ranger station crackled with warnings. Flash flood watches for all arroyos, severe thunderstorm watches, dust storm potential. Standard August fare. The monument stretched across 14,000 acres of high desert canyon country, with Honey Hole Canyon itself a 4-mile deep cut through rust-red sandstone that ran seasonal water only during the heaviest rains. Tyler filled his coffee mug at the station's small kitchenette, lukewarm water that would stay warm in the thermos even as the day heated up, and checked his equipment. Radio on the Ranger frequency, GPS unit with fresh batteries, flashlight, first aid kit. The usual items that a ranger carried, most of them never needed, but all of them critical on the day when they were actually required. The work itself was simple: patrol the access roads, maintain the 3 marked trails, monitor the water at the canyon's base for flash flood potential, and manage the small number of visitors who came to the monument seeking something quieter than the national parks. The landscape around the ranger station was stunning in its austerity. The monument consisted primarily of high desert, scrub brush, yucca, the occasional ponderosa pine on the higher elevations. The canyon itself cut through this landscape like an afterthought, a massive scar in the earth that revealed millions of years of geological history in its walls. Layer upon layer of red, orange, brown, and rust-colored sandstone, each stratum representing different geological epochs. The canyon had been carved by water, though it rarely flowed now except in monsoon season when the rains came, and Honey Hole Canyon became a torrent that would sweep away anything in its path. Tyler checked the visitor log as he did every morning. Yesterday had brought 6 hikers, 3 in the morning, 3 in the late afternoon. All had checked out, all had signed back in. The monument kept detailed records because people could disappear in places like this, and had historically. Tyler had read the old incident reports, the stories of visitors who'd wandered off trail in the 1970s and 80s, who'd never been found. That was why the ranger station existed now. That was why Tyler was here. The morning patrol was routine. He drove the access road that ran along the canyon's east rim, checking for downed trees, washouts, and any signs of recent visitor damage. Everything was in order. The trails, Crimson Overlook, Canyon Bottom, and the challenging rim-to-rim descent were clear and marked with the standard Forest Service blazes. No recent storm damage, no apparent issues. By early afternoon, Tyler was back at the station eating a sandwich when the visitor check-in occurred. A young woman in her early 20s with a day pack and hiking boots, wanting to do the Canyon Bottom Trail. Tyler remembered the moment clearly because she'd been particularly striking. Dark hair, pale skin that clearly didn't spend much time in the desert sun, and eyes that held that specific kind of curiosity that meant she was a serious hiker, not just a casual tourist wandering through for the photo opportunity. "How long have you been hiking?" Tyler asked, filling out the check-in form with her information. "About 5 years," she said. Her name was Harper Caldwell. She lived in Phoenix. She'd done most of Arizona's major trails and wanted to experience some of the lesser-known monuments. "I know about the monsoon risk. I'll be back by 5 o'clock. I'm fast." Tyler studied the sky. The heat was building. That particular pressure in the air that meant the monsoon was developing somewhere north, somewhere over the Mogollon Rim. Storms probably not here until late afternoon, but the moment you see clouds building, I want you off that trail and heading back up. Understood? This canyon floods fast. "I understand," Harper said. She signed the check-in form, noted her entry time, 1:47 p.m., and headed for the Crimson Overlook parking area where the Canyon Bottom Trail began. Tyler watched her go. He'd done this hundreds of times, checked in hikers, explained the hazards, sent them off into the monument's interior. Most came back. Some came back with stories. A very few didn't come back at all. Harper Caldwell had been hiking the Southwest for 5 years, ever since a college geology class had sparked something in her that all her other academic pursuits had failed to ignite. There was something profound about reading stone that had been exposed for millions of years, about walking where water had carved its path through ancient rock, about feeling yourself as part of a geological timeline that made human concerns seem appropriately small. The canyon bottom trail was challenging but manageable, a steep descent from the rim down to where water sometimes flowed, then a return along the canyon floor if you wanted to see the geological layers in detail. Harper had brought water, electrolyte tablets, and a sun hat. She'd checked the weather. She was prepared. The descent took 45 minutes. The trail was well marked, the switchbacks carefully engineered, and the views got better as she descended. The canyon walls rose on either side of her, each one displaying a fascinating cross-section of time. Bands of Supai group formation, rust-red and orange layers that told a story of ancient seas and deserts. Red wall limestone above it. The views were worth every breath of exertion. At the canyon bottom, the trail leveled and she could see the seasonal water channel, dry now, but showing signs of previous flooding. Large boulders had been rolled and repositioned by water. Sand and silt lined the arroyo. Everything here was shaped by the occasional violence of flowing water. Harper checked her watch. 2:35 p.m. She'd been on the trail for less than an hour. The ranger had said she'd be back by 5, and she would be, easily. She decided to walk a bit further along the canyon floor to see how the geology changed at different points in the canyon. The walk was peaceful. The heat was intense, but it was a dry heat. Her sweat evaporated as fast as it formed, and the canyon's depth provided some shadow from the afternoon sun. She could hear the wind moving over the rim far above, a distant whisper, but here in the canyon, there was almost no wind. The silence was complete except for the occasional sound of her own footsteps on the stone. It was around 3:15 that Harper first noticed something wrong with the light. The canyon around her was getting darker. She looked up, expecting to see clouds building, but the patch of sky visible at the canyon's rim was still relatively clear. Yet the light filtering down into the canyon was distinctly dimmer, more orange-tinted, carrying that particular quality that meant dust in the atmosphere. Harper checked her phone. 2 bars of signal. 3:17 p.m. She could still see maybe 2 hours before sunset, and the hike back up would take 45 minutes. Even if a storm was developing, she had plenty of time. She continued walking. The color of the light got stranger the further she walked. More orange now, almost rust-colored, as if the world itself was filtering through oxidized metal. Harper had never seen light quite like this. It was beautiful but deeply unsettling, like watching a sunset in real time while the sun was still high. Then she heard the sound. It came from above, a cry that was almost like a bird call but larger, deeper, carrying frequencies that didn't sound entirely natural. Harper stopped and looked up. At the rim of the canyon, perhaps 100 meters above, she could see something moving. Large, dark against the orange-tinted sky. A hawk, probably. Or a raven. Arizona had large birds of prey. She'd heard the ranger mention mountain lions and bears, but birds were less concerning. Still, the size of what she'd seen seemed wrong. Whatever it was had been much larger than any hawk she'd ever encountered. Harper started walking back toward the trailhead. The light continued to deteriorate. By 3:45, it was so dark that Harper had to turn on her phone's flashlight to see the trail clearly. The sky above the canyon rim was now a deep orange-brown, the kind of color you saw just before a major dust storm arrived. Harper had been in Phoenix during monsoon season. She'd experienced haboobs, the massive walls of dust that could reduce visibility to nothing, but she'd never seen the precursor light quite like this. The wind started then, sudden and strong, coming in hard gusts down the canyon. It carried the smell of dust and heat and something else, something that reminded Harper of old feathers, of something that had been dead for a long time. Harper walked faster. The trail up the canyon was steeper going up than coming down, and the increasing darkness made it harder to see the switchbacks clearly. Harper's phone light caught rocks and shadows in ways that made her depth perception uncertain. Several times she had to pause, get her bearings, and make sure she was on the actual trail and not scrambling up loose rock. By 4:15, Harper could see that the sky above the rim had become genuinely dark. Not the natural darkness of approaching evening, but something darker, something wrong. The clouds that had been building must be massive. They'd filled the entire sky, and the wind was getting stronger, gusting hard enough now that Harper had to brace herself against the canyon wall to keep from being blown off her feet. She was still maybe 20 minutes from the rim, still on the marked trail, still safe, technically. But something in the way the light was failing, in the way the wind was behaving, in the smell that kept hitting her on the harder gusts, was telling her that she needed to move faster. Harper started climbing harder, her legs burning from the exertion, her breath coming in gasps in the thin, high desert air. The phone light bounced wildly with her movement, making the shadows dance. And in those dancing shadows, Harper became certain she saw movement. Large movement, keeping pace with her as she climbed. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She just climbed faster, and the sound came again from above. That cry that was almost a bird call but wasn't quite. Something that had a layer of intelligence to it. Something that sounded like it was hunting. Tyler was monitoring the weather when the light changed. He was at the ranger station, watching the computer screen displaying the latest satellite imagery and radar data. The monsoon was developing rapidly, moving in from the north faster than the morning forecast had suggested. What had been a general storm watch was becoming a specific storm warning. He checked the visitor log. Harper Caldwell had checked in at 1:47 p.m. It was now 4:30 p.m. If she'd done the canyon bottom trail as marked, 2.5 hours round trip, she should have been back by 4:30. She wasn't at the station. She wasn't answering her checkout form. Tyler stepped outside. The light was definitely wrong. The sky was a sick orange-brown and the wind was beginning to gust, the precursor to the main storm. Dust was in the air, blown from somewhere north, turning the world into something that looked more like dusk than late afternoon. The temperature, which had been holding around 104 degrees, was dropping noticeably as the storm approached. He keyed his radio. Visitor checkout at Crimson Overlook. Vehicle is still in parking area. Visitor hasn't returned yet. He was speaking to himself, but it was protocol to log these observations. Monitoring situation. Will advise if assistance is needed. Tyler got in his truck and drove to the Crimson Overlook parking area. The wind was stronger here, at the canyon's edge. He could see Harper's car, a red Honda Civic, parked in one of the spots. The parking area was otherwise empty. It was 4:35 p.m. The hike was supposed to take 2.5 hours. The storm was building rapidly overhead. Tyler checked the weather again on his phone. The radar showed a severe thunderstorm developing directly over the monument. Lightning was already occurring, and hail was possible. The storm was maybe 30 minutes away from the parking area, but much closer to the canyon itself. He keyed the radio again. Dispatch, this is Honey Hole Canyon Ranger Station. I have a missing visitor situation developing. Female hiker, name Harper Caldwell, checked in at approximately 1:47 p.m. on the Canyon Bottom Trail. Standard route should have her back by 4:15. It's now 4:35 and she hasn't returned. Storm is moving in. I'm going to conduct a search. Static. Then dispatch came back, her voice carrying that particular quality of controlled concern that meant she understood the situation. Copy, Honey Hole. What's the visitor's experience level? Moderate to high, Tyler responded. She knew about the weather risk, but the storm moved in faster than forecast. I'm starting a search up the canyon bottom trail. Copy. Weather Service is issuing a flash flood warning for all Arizona arroyos. Be aware of water movement. What's your ETA for completion of initial search? 2 hours maximum. If I don't locate her, I'll need SAR mobilized. Understood. We'll put out an alert. Stay in radio contact. Tyler grabbed his gear from the truck, a heavier flashlight, additional water, first aid kit, and a rope. The canyon bottom trail was descended via switchbacks, but if he needed to move quickly, he could rappel down sections of it. He didn't think it would come to that, but it was good to have the option. He started down the trail at a jog. Harper's last moment of certainty came at the place where the canyon widened slightly, where she could see the arroyo on both sides of the rock formation she was climbing. She could see the canyon floor now despite the darkness, and she could see that the dry arroyo was beginning to have a sheen on its surface. Water, the rain that was building above the rim, the rain that hadn't reached the canyon floor yet, was starting to run down from somewhere upstream, beginning the slow accumulation that would become a flood. She was roughly halfway up the trail, still 20 minutes from the rim, but the water was coming. Harper climbed harder, her legs screaming, her lungs burning, but she pushed through it. She could see the switchbacks ahead, could almost see the rim. The light was so dark now that her phone light was the primary source of illumination, and everything outside its beam was shadow. The cry came again from above. Much closer now. Not a hawk. Definitely not a hawk. The size and the quality of the sound made it clear that whatever was hunting her wasn't any ordinary bird. Harper looked up and she saw it. At first it was just a shape against the dark sky, a silhouette that was wrong, proportioned in ways that nothing natural should be proportioned. But as it moved, the light of her phone caught it more clearly, and Harper's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It was massive, at least as tall as a man, if not taller. But that was where the resemblance to anything ordinary ended. The body was avian but exaggerated, twisted into something that combined bird and human anatomy in ways that made no evolutionary sense. The head was the worst. It was almost human. She could see the suggestion of a face, of eyes that looked at her with intelligence. But it was also entirely bird-like, with a beak that curved and long ears that rose from the sides of the head like horns. The wings, when the creature spread them against the wind, spanned what looked like 12 feet or more. Harper tried to scream, but the sound that came out was something less than a scream, something that her throat produced almost involuntarily, a sound of pure animal terror. The creature threw its head back and made its hunting cry again. This close, Harper could hear layers to it that she hadn't detected before. There was something almost like laughter in there, something almost like hunger. Harper turned and ran up the trail without any sense of where she was going, trusting only that upward was better than being on the canyon floor where the creature could reach her more easily. Her phone light bounced wildly with her movement, creating shadows that seemed to pursue her more aggressively than the creature itself. Behind her, the creature descended, not flying. It moved like it was crawling through the air, using its wings like limbs, moving in ways that nothing with wings should be able to move. Harper reached the next switchback and threw herself around it, risking a look back. The creature was maybe 50 meters behind her now, descending the trail, moving with surprising speed and grace. It was hurting her, she realized, not trying to catch her on the canyon wall where it might be difficult. Driving her toward something. Toward where? Harper's thought fractured as a flash of lightning illuminated the entire canyon. Thunder followed immediately. The storm was nearly overhead now. And in that flash of light, Harper saw what the creature was herding her toward. Further up the canyon, at a point that should have been the start of the climbing trail, there was an overhang, a cave or shelter of some kind that Harper hadn't noticed on her descent, because the light had been different, and at the entrance to that shelter there were things, objects arranged in patterns. Harper's mind, even as it was processing the presence of a creature from nightmare, recognized what those objects were. Remains, clothing, bones possibly, the remains of other hikers who had come to Honey Hole Canyon and never made it out. Harper screamed then, a real scream that echoed off the canyon walls, and she ran with everything she had left. Tyler was halfway down the canyon when he felt the first drops of rain. Not a gentle beginning to a storm. These were large drops, spaced apart, the kind that usually meant the main deluge was seconds away. He increased his pace, moving down the switchbacks faster than was entirely safe, because he understood what was about to happen. Flash floods in arroyos didn't begin with water at ground level. They began upstream, built momentum, and became a wall of water moving at tremendous speed. The arroyo's water was already beginning to move. He could see it accumulating, hear it rushing from upstream in the distance. "Dispatch, I'm in the canyon," he radioed. Rain starting. Water movement in the arroyo. Continuing search, but will need to abort if conditions deteriorate. Copy, Honeyhole. National Weather Service has elevated the flash flood warning to critical. Any sign of the hiker? Negative, still searching. The rain intensified. It went from scattered large drops to a genuine downpour in the space of maybe 30 seconds. Tyler could barely see 10 meters ahead. The canyon walls around him became suggestions, glimpses between sheets of rain. The water in the arroyo was definitely moving now, and the sound from upstream was becoming louder. The sound of a major volume of water accumulating and beginning to flow toward lower elevations. Tyler was so focused on the increasing danger of the water and the degrading conditions that he almost missed the sound. But it cut through the rain and the increasing roar of the arroyo. A scream. A human scream, coming from somewhere further up the canyon. Dispatch, I have audible indication of the hiker. Continuing search up canyon. Tyler started climbing, moving faster now, not bothering with the switchbacks, just scrambling directly up the canyon wall. His hands found purchase on the stone, his feet found ledges. The rain was making everything slippery, but the urgency overrode the danger. He heard the sound again. Not a scream this time, but a sound of pure terror, wordless and animal. And then he heard something else. A cry that was almost a scream itself, but came from a throat that wasn't human. A hunting cry. Tyler froze for just a moment as his brain tried to process what he'd heard. That wasn't a cougar. It wasn't a bear. It was something else. Something he'd never heard before, but something his body recognized as fundamentally wrong. Tyler reached for his radio. Dispatch, I'm hearing unusual animal sounds in the canyon. Something large, not a known species. Continuing search. He pulled himself up over another ledge, and that's when he saw her. Harper Caldwell was climbing toward him, her clothes soaked through, her face running with rain and tears. She was maybe 30 meters above him, moving with the desperate energy of something being pursued. And behind her, descending the canyon wall with a grace that nothing natural should possess, was something that Tyler's mind refused at first to acknowledge. His training said cougar, mountain lion, predatory mammal. His eyes said something else entirely. The creature was massive, avian, wrong in every way that Tyler understood natural order. It moved with intelligence, with purpose, herding Harper toward something rather than directly attacking. And when it turned its head to look in Tyler's direction, its eyes held a clarity that said it understood he was there, that it was aware of him, that he was part of whatever calculation it was making. "Get up here," Tyler yelled at Harper, extending his hand toward her. "Now, come on!" Harper scrambled toward him with renewed energy, seeing a different way out, seeing rescue. She reached his position and Tyler grabbed her arm, pulling her up beside him. The creature on the wall below them paused, and the sound it made was that hunting cry again, that almost laughter that suggested intelligence and hunger combined in a way that nature had no business creating. Lightning struck somewhere nearby. Tyler felt the hair on his arm stand up with static, and the canyon flooded with light. In that light, he got his first clear look at the thing that was hunting them. It was like nothing in any field guide, any biology text, any ranger training. The body was avian, massive wings, feathered, obviously adapted for flight. But the head was wrong. The face was wrong. There was intelligence there, malice there. And as he watched, the creature opened its mouth and made a sound that was less cry and more language, something with layers and meaning, something that almost sounded like speech. Tyler grabbed Harper and pulled her toward the canyon wall, moving along a narrow ledge toward the shelter he could now see. The overhang he'd noticed earlier, the place where the creature seemed to be herding them. But as they reached it, Tyler understood what the shelter actually was. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a collection point, a place where things came to gather what they'd caught. The cave extended back into the stone, and what Tyler's flashlight revealed at its entrance was a horror that forced him to look away. The remains of visitors, of hikers, of people who'd come to Honey Hole Canyon and never left. Clothing arranged carefully, bones arranged in patterns that suggested not careless scattering but deliberate placement. Offering, maybe. Or trophies. No, Harper whispered beside him. No, no, no. The creature descended the final 20 meters of canyon wall and landed on the stone in front of the cave entrance. Its wings spread wide, creating a silhouette against the ongoing lightning. Thunder rumbled so hard that Tyler felt it through the stone at his back, and the creature made its sound again. That cry that was almost language, that hunting call that contained something almost like satisfaction. Tyler realized in that moment what he was looking at, not a modern creature, not an evolution or biological anomaly, something older. Something that had been hunting in this canyon long before the monument existed, long before rangers had come to monitor and manage the land. The indigenous peoples of the Southwest had stories about creatures like this. The Lechuza, a predatory spirit, a shapeshifter, a territorial entity that didn't permit trespassers. He'd read about it once in an old ranger's journal from the 1970s. He'd dismissed it as folklore, superstition, the product of a ranger losing his mind in isolation. Now Tyler understood that some dismissals were mistakes. Back, he said to Harper, pulling her further into the cave even as every instinct screamed at him not to go deeper into the creature's lair. We need to go back, deeper. There might be another way out. They stumbled backward into the darkness of the cave, away from the creature that was blocking the entrance. The cave descended as they moved, the floor angling downward. Tyler's flashlight caught the surfaces around them and bounced off stone that was oddly smooth, polished in places, as if this cave had been traveled for thousands of years. They moved for what felt like minutes but was probably only 30 seconds, far enough that the entrance was no longer visible, far enough that they were in complete darkness, except for Tyler's flashlight. Behind them, the creature made no attempt to follow. It simply waited at the entrance as if it knew that the cave was a dead end, as if it understood that Tyler and Harper had only delayed the inevitable. Tyler found a side passage about 50 meters in and pulled Harper into it. The passage climbed slightly, and after maybe 20 meters, fresh air began to flow. And then, a gap, a break in the rock, leading upward. Tyler shone his flashlight through and saw stars. Open sky. This way, he said. Move. They scrambled upward through the passage, Tyler pushing Harper up and in front of him. The passage was tight, forcing them to crawl in places, but the fresh air and the visible sky above were worth every moment of claustrophobia. They emerged on the canyon rim, away from the overhang, away from the creature, in the clearing rain where the main body of the monsoon was continuing to dump water across the high desert. Tyler looked back toward the canyon. He couldn't see the cave entrance anymore. Couldn't see anything in the darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the landscape. But he didn't need to see it to know the creature was still there, still waiting, still hunting in the way it had hunted for however long these entities hunted. Come on, he said to Harper. We need to get to the ranger station. They ran through the rain, through the darkness, following Tyler's knowledge of the land. Behind them at the canyon's rim, something made a hunting cry that the wind seemed to carry for miles before swallowing it into the night. The official report listed Harper Caldwell as a hiker who had gotten lost in Honey Hole Canyon during a severe monsoon event. She'd been found by Ranger Tyler Reeves after a brief search. She was dehydrated and in shock, but otherwise unharmed. The incident was attributed to weather and terrain hazards. Search and rescue never needed to mobilize. What the report didn't include was any mention of what had been seen in the canyon, the arrangement of remains in the cave, the creature that had hunted them, the intelligence that had been in that thing's eyes. Tyler hadn't included those details. He knew how they would be received. He knew what people would say. He also knew that Harper, when questioned by SAR personnel and the official investigators, had said nothing about the creature. She'd mentioned getting lost, mentioned seeing the cave during her descent, mentioned the fear and the difficulty of the climb back up, but nothing about what had been hunting her. They had made an unspoken agreement not to speak of it, because some things, when spoken aloud, became undeniable in ways that made them harder to live with. Harper had left Arizona the next day. She didn't return to hiking after the incident. Tyler had heard through the grapevine that she'd moved back to the Midwest, away from the Southwest and its canyons and high deserts. She didn't want to be in a place where you could go looking for solitude in stone and find something looking back with ancient intelligence. Tyler still works as the primary ranger at Honey Hole Canyon National Monument. The visitation has increased slightly. People are drawn to places with stories, to places with danger. But Tyler has noticed something. Fewer people hike the canyon bottom trail now. Fewer people venture to the deepest parts of the canyon. And the ranger station logs show a pattern that mirrors other protected lands. Certain areas begin to gain reputations. Certain trails become known as places where people should be careful. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, Tyler stands at the canyon rim and looks down at the landscape, trying to see if there's any sign of the creature. There never is. It doesn't need to advertise its presence. It knows what it is. It knows what it hunts. It knows that the canyon is its territory, has been for longer than humans have had words to name things. And every few seasons, despite all the warnings, spoken and unspoken, another hiker disappears in Honey Hole Canyon during a monsoon event. Their car sits in the parking lot. Their check-in form notes their intended trail, but they never return. Tyler files the reports. He conducts the searches. He finds nothing, usually. And he wonders if the creature is still adding to its collection in that cave, still arranging its trophies, still maintaining its ancient territory against the encroachment of humans who keep coming, despite all warnings, despite all the signs, desperate for solitude in stone and willing to accept the risks that come with it. The canyon doesn't kill its hikers. That's what people always get wrong. The canyon is just stone and air. It's what hunts in the canyon that kills them. It's what has hunted there since before the canyons had names, since before people came with maps and official designations. It's what will hunt there long after Honey Hole Canyon National Monument is forgotten. Location: Guadalupe Mountains National Park, Texas. Date: August 14th, 2018. The pre-dawn air at the Frijole Ridge Ranger Station was already warm, not merely hot, but the kind of deep, suffocating warmth that came from the earth itself radiating the heat it had accumulated the day before. James Caldwell had been a ranger at Guadalupe Mountains for 9 years, long enough to understand that August was the month when the land became something closer to an adversary than a park. The monsoon season had arrived with its erratic fury, sudden downpours that created flash floods capable of sweeping away hikers and vehicles alike, followed by hours of brutal, unrelenting heat that turned the limestone canyons into ovens. The temperature would reach 102 degrees by afternoon. By midnight, it would drop to 40. He stood on the small porch of the station with a cup of coffee that had already begun to cool in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the eastern ridges gradually separate themselves from the black sky. The mountains here were different from the other ranges he'd worked, sharper, more dramatic, almost aggressive in their geometry. The Guadalupes rose abruptly from the desert floor, their peaks limestone white, their slopes dense with pine and fir in the higher elevations where moisture gathered. Lower down, the vegetation thinned to scrubland and skeletal trees that had learned to survive on minimal water. Everything here was shaped by scarcity. Everything had learned to take what it needed and waste nothing, including the things that lived here that weren't human. The forecast had promised clear skies for most of the day, with possible monsoonal activity developing around sunset. The humidity was building. James could smell it in the air. That particular mineral scent that came before storms, the ozone-like tang that made the sky feel closer than it should be. It was 0530 hours. Sunrise was still 40 minutes away. The station was quiet except for the ambient hum of the radio, occasionally crackling with overnight traffic from other parks, other rangers, the constant low-level communication that kept the wilderness service connected to itself. James had established his morning routine years ago, and he maintained it with the consistency that came from years of working alone in remote locations. Coffee at Oro 500, weather check at Oro 515, permit review at Oro 530, equipment verification at Oro 545. By 0600, he would be out for his first trail inspection of the day, covering the most popular routes, McKittrick Canyon, the Devil's Hall Trail, Guadalupe Peak, to ensure that overnight storms or rockfall had created no new hazards. The park was receiving perhaps 150 visitors per day during peak August season, and while most stuck to the well-marked trails, some had the confidence born of ignorance that convinced them to explore beyond marked boundaries. He pulled up the overnight permit registrations on the station's computer, a machine that was approximately 15 years old and ran with all the speed that technology of that vintage could muster. 2 parties had filed overnight permits, a group of 4 climbing Guadalupe Peak who had checked in at the trailhead at 1400 hours yesterday, and a solo hiker named Harper Cole, who had registered for a 3-day backcountry expedition starting at the North McKittrick trailhead. Harper's permit specified experience in wilderness navigation, equipment including satellite communication, and a planned route through some of the more remote canyons, Water Canyon, Bear Canyon, the upper sections of McKittrick that saw foot traffic only during spring season. Harper had been due back by 1800 hours today. In the meantime, she was out there somewhere in the dark, presumably on her first night of camping, assuming she'd decided to actually follow her stated itinerary. James had learned not to assume anything about backcountry permits. Some people followed them exactly. Others treated them as rough suggestions. A few used them as covers for entirely different activities. Harper Cole's permit photograph showed a woman in her late 20s, dark hair pulled back, standing in front of a canyon background that James recognized as somewhere in California, probably Joshua Tree or similar. The credential listed her as a wildlife photographer specializing in nocturnal species. The note on her permit indicated she was planning to photograph bats migrating through the Guadalupe canyons during their August movement patterns. That explained the 3-day duration and the remote location selection. The bats moved through specific corridors, and the best viewing was away from the main trails where human activity wouldn't disturb the migration. James approved the permit without hesitation. The woman clearly knew what she was doing. That was something he would remember later, the simple confidence with which he'd made that judgment, based on a photograph and a credential and the assumption that experience meant safety. It was one of the few things he would remember clearly after everything that followed. Harper Cole had reached her first campsite at approximately 1600 hours, establishing herself in a small clearing, roughly 2 miles up Water Canyon from the marked trailhead. The location was technically within park boundaries, but far enough from main trails that she'd seen no other hikers all day. The canyon walls rose steep and dramatic on both sides, limestone faces weathered by millennia, streaked with mineral deposits that created patterns almost like writing, almost like language, if you looked at them long enough. She'd spent the first 3 hours of daylight hiking slowly, photographing flora, checking canyon walls for signs of nocturnal habitation, guano deposits, roost marks, the small details that indicated where the bats spent their days sleeping. The heat had been intense but manageable with proper hydration. She'd brought 5 liters of water and a satellite communication device that was, frankly, overkill for a modern backcountry trip. But the insurance company for her wildlife photography business had insisted. She'd obliged them by activating it once, checking that the device worked, then packing it away. The permit and the credential were real. The expertise was genuine. Harper had spent 6 seasons photographing bats across the southwestern United States, and she had accumulated knowledge about migration patterns that most casual hikers would never possess. She knew which canyons the bats preferred. She knew the timing of their movements. She knew how to remain still for hours, how to set up remote camera traps, how to exist in wilderness in a state of patient observation rather than anxious movement. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the bats weren't the only things that lived in these canyons, or the only things that were drawn to them during migration season. As the day had progressed and the heat had built, Harper had begun to notice something odd about the canyon's acoustics. Sound traveled strangely here, echoing from wall to wall in ways that made it difficult to determine where sources actually were. A bird's call from the left would seem to bounce to the right, then upward, then downward. The wind, when it came, seemed to originate from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the canyon were breathing from multiple mouths. By 1400 hours, She'd become aware of another sound underneath the wind and the birds and the distant rustle of her own movement. It was a clicking sound, rhythmic, deliberate, almost like Morse code, almost like language. She'd attributed it to insects, perhaps cicadas or some other arthropod species. She'd made a mental note to investigate. At 15:30 hours, as the afternoon heat reached its peak and the canyon walls seemed to radiate warmth that was almost visible, Harper had heard something else. It was a cry, high-pitched, almost childlike, a sound of distress or alarm. It had come from above her, from the direction of a narrow band of vegetation that clung to the canyon rim. She looked up, expecting to see an animal, a young bighorn sheep perhaps, or a mountain lion cub, but saw nothing except the pale rock and the dark vegetation silhouetted against the bright sky. The cry hadn't repeated. The canyon had returned to its normal background noise, wind, rustling, distant bird calls. Harper had continued setting up her camp, choosing a location with good sightlines toward a likely roosting area, where she'd positioned her remote camera traps. Now at 2100 hours, with full darkness arrived and the temperature already dropping rapidly, Harper was beginning to understand that the quiet of the canyon was not, as she'd initially assessed, a normal wilderness quiet. It was an absence of sound where sound should be. The crickets and insects that should have been active after dark were gone. The nocturnal bird calls that she would normally expect, the owls, the nighthawks, the other creatures that emerged as the sun set, were completely absent. The canyon was silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if something had arrived and everything else had evacuated in response. Harper had experienced wilderness loneliness many times before. She enjoyed it. There was something clarifying about complete solitude, about being the only human heartbeat for miles in any direction. But this silence was different. This silence felt like attention, like the landscape itself was watching her, waiting for something. She was sitting near her camp, reviewing photographs on the back of her camera, when she heard the first clearly non-insect sound of the evening. It was a voice, a human voice. It was calling her name. Harper. Just that. Her name, spoken softly, from somewhere down canyon, toward the direction of the trailhead she'd hiked in from that morning. Harper turned toward the sound, her hand instinctively moving to her satellite communicator. Though she didn't activate it, hikers occasionally pushed beyond their intended routes. Someone might have become lost, might have decided to camp in her general area, might have heard her setting up camp and was calling to establish contact. "Hello?" she called back. "I'm just ahead." There was no response. She waited 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. The silence returned, complete and absolute. Harper told herself that the sound had probably been an echo. Canyons created strange acoustic effects. The human brain was prone to pattern recognition, to interpreting random noise as familiar sounds. She'd heard her name because she expected to hear human voices because on some level, her brain was concerned about being alone, was primed to detect signs of other humans. She settled back into reviewing her photographs, checking the settings on her camera traps, ensuring that she had clear sight lines for the nocturnal photography work. The bats would begin emerging around 2200 hours. She could set her watch by it. The heat of the day would be sufficiently diminished, the insects more active, the conditions optimal for feeding. She wanted to be ready. At 2145 hours, she heard the sound again. It was still her name. It was still coming from down canyon, but this time it was closer. "Harper. Harper, come here. There's something you need to see." It was a woman's voice this time. Not young, not old, ageless in that way that voices sometimes were when they carried on wind through open spaces. It was speaking in Spanish-accented English, each word precise and deliberate. And there was something familiar about it, though Harper knew she'd never heard it before. Something that made her spine tighten with an instinct she didn't quite understand. She stood up. She was aware of her own heartbeat now, which had been absent from her consciousness a moment before. She was aware of the drop in temperature. It had fallen perhaps 10 degrees in the last hour, the desert chill settling in as the radiating heat dissipated. She was aware that she was alone, and that there was someone or something else in the canyon with her, and that the thing calling her name seemed to want her to move toward it. "I'm here," Harper called back. Where are you? Down here, the voice said. In the deep canyon. In the places where the sun doesn't reach. Come see. You'll want to see this. Harper's rational mind provided several explanations. Another hiker, disoriented by the darkness. Someone with a satellite radio trying to establish contact. A recorded voice from some source she wasn't identifying. All of these explanations were technically possible. All of them required her to ignore the thing her body was telling her. That this was not another hiker. That this was not someone in need of help. That the thing calling her name in that precise, careful voice was something that should remain at a distance. She activated her satellite communicator. At the ranger station, James was finishing his evening administrative work when the emergency beacon activated. Not a full emergency. That would have been a different signal entirely. But a request for assistance, a need support alert from a registered backcountry communicator. The location placed it in Water Canyon, approximately 2 miles from the marked trailhead, within the park boundaries but in relatively remote terrain. James didn't hesitate. He logged the incident, confirmed with dispatch that he was responding, and began gathering equipment. A hiker was requesting assistance in the backcountry. This could be anything from a twisted ankle to dehydration to simple panic at being alone in wilderness at night. He grabbed his pack, his two-way radio, his flashlight, his emergency medical kit, and headed out toward the North McKittrick trailhead. The drive would take 20 minutes. The hike to Harper's location would take 45 minutes to an hour in darkness, moving carefully through terrain he knew, but that would be treacherous with limited visibility. The night was clear. The full moon James had noted in the weather forecast was rising now, pale and swollen, providing enough light that he didn't need his flashlight for the initial trail section. The temperature had dropped rapidly, and the air was that peculiar combination of desert cold and residual heat that made August nights in the Guadalupes almost comfortable after the brutal afternoon. He reached the trailhead at 22:10 hours, confirmed his location with dispatch, and began hiking up canyon. The route was familiar. He'd covered this trail dozens of times, knew every major rock formation, every water source, every section where the terrain became technical. Moving in darkness required more caution, but the moonlight was sufficient. He made good time. At 22:45 hours, he contacted Harper on his radio. "This is Ranger Caldwell with Park Services. I received your assistance request. What's your location and situation?" There was a delay before the response came, longer than the 3 or 4 seconds typically required for radio transmission. The voice that came back was calm, but James recognized the undertone of fear in it, the controlled response of someone trying hard not to panic. "Ranger, I'm approximately 2 miles up Water Canyon from the main trailhead. I activated the communicator out of caution. I'm hearing voices. Someone calling my name. I can't locate the source. Weather is clear. I have adequate supplies, no injury. But I think I should have someone here with me." "Copy," James said. "Estimate I'll reach your location in approximately 30 minutes. Stay where you are. Maintain contact. Tell me exactly what you're hearing." "There's someone in the canyon," Harper said, calling to me, speaking in English but with an accent I can't place. A woman's voice. "She's been calling for the last 10 minutes, asking me to come down canyon, moving farther away from my camp each time I hear her. This could be weather phenomenon. This could be acoustic tricks from canyon amplification." James had encountered hikers who were convinced they were hearing voices, only to discover the sound source was wind through a narrow passage, or an animal cry, or the hiker's own exhaustion and isolation, creating phantom noises. What exactly is she saying? "She's asking me to come look at something. Says I'll want to see it. The voice seems old, but I can't identify any regional accent. It's strange, Ranger. Something feels wrong." James was moving faster now, ascending the canyon with confidence born of years of knowing this terrain. "I'm en route. Don't move from your camp. Don't follow any sounds. Stay where you are and keep this channel open." "Copy," Harper said. Then, after a pause, "Ranger, I think she just responded to you. I can hear her saying something about you. She sounds angry." James didn't respond immediately. He was processing the logistics of the situation. Radio transmission shouldn't be audible to someone in close proximity using a different device, unless their communicator was receiving feedback, or unless there were two separate people with communicators in the canyon, or unless... He pushed the thought away. Stick to practical considerations. Continue moving. Reach the victim. Determine the situation. By 23:05 hours, he could see Harper's camp, a small figure huddled near a low campfire, illuminated by both the moonlight and the flames she'd kindled. She looked up as he approached, and James saw the relief wash across her face before it was replaced by something closer to uncertainty. "Thank God," she said. "I've been hearing it for 20 minutes now. It's getting louder, coming closer. I tried to ignore it, but..." She stopped. She was looking past James, back down the canyon in the direction he'd just come from. "It's behind you," Harper said quietly. "Do you hear it?" James turned. He stood very still, listening. The canyon was a theater of sound and silence. Wind moved through the vegetation. The creek that gave Water Canyon its name murmured in the distance. The normal sounds of desert wilderness at night, and underneath all of that, so quiet he almost couldn't distinguish it from the other sounds, there was something else. It was the sound of wings. Large wings, moving through the air with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound was coming from directly above him, perhaps 30 feet up, where the canyon walls rose like cliffs. The sound of something very large moving through the darkness with absolute precision. "Go inside the fire's light," James said to Harper. He was activating his radio as he spoke. "Dispatch, I'm at the Water Canyon location with the permit holder. Situation is unclear. Something large in the airspace above our location. Possibly a bird, but behavior is unusual." The radio crackled. "Copy, Unit 3. What is your assessment?" James didn't answer immediately. He was watching the sky above the canyon. The moon was bright enough that he should have been able to see the shape moving above them. He should have seen it clearly. Instead, he could only see darkness, a section of sky that seemed darker than it should be, moving with the sound of wings but refusing to be resolved into any distinct visual form. The sound of wings stopped. In the silence that followed, James heard something else. It was a sound that he recognized immediately, though not from any recent experience. It was a sound he'd heard once years ago on a nature documentary about owls. It was a scream, the shriek of a hunting bird, the predatory call that preceded an attack. Except no owl in the Guadalupe Mountains screamed like that. No owl anywhere screamed like that. The sound was too loud, too reverberating, too laden with something that transcended animal vocalization. It was a sound that carried intelligence and malice and an ancient hunger that had nothing to do with feeding and everything to do with claiming territory. Harper had moved to the far side of her camp away from James, pressing herself against the canyon wall. "What is that?" she whispered. "What is that sound?" James didn't answer. He was reaching into his pack for the signal flare he carried, standard equipment for search and rescue situations, useful for signaling aircraft. He pulled the small canister out and aimed it upward, into the darkness where the wings had been. He ignited it. The flare shot upward, a brilliant red light that illuminated the canyon in harsh, unforgiving detail. For a moment, James saw the thing that was hunting them. It was perched on the canyon rim, perhaps 20 meters above them. It was an owl. That much was immediately apparent from the shape, the posture, the massive wings folded against its body. But it was an owl that should not have existed. It was perhaps 5 feet tall, with a wingspan that seemed to extend nearly 12 feet when it spread its wings in response to the flare light. Its head rotated toward the light with unnatural speed, a full 180-degree rotation that no natural owl could manage. And its eyes. James would spend the rest of his life trying to accurately describe those eyes, and failing every time. They were not animal eyes. They were intelligent, conscious, focused on him with an intensity that suggested not predatory hunger, but something closer to recognition. As if the thing was seeing him, truly seeing him, and remembering him, and holding a grudge against him specifically for reasons that predated their current encounter. The flare burned out. The darkness returned. In the darkness, James heard the sound of wings again, but now it was moving toward them. He pulled Harper to her feet and they ran, not down canyon toward the trailhead, but up canyon toward the steeper terrain, toward the places where flying predators would have difficulty maneuvering. Behind them, the sound of wings grew closer. Harper tripped. James caught her and pulled her up. They were running blind now, the moonlight insufficient, the terrain treacherous, the canyon walls invisible except as darker shapes against the dark sky. Behind them, the creature had landed on something. James heard the impact, heard the shower of rock and debris cascading down the canyon wall. He made a decision. He pulled Harper into a narrow crevasse, a space between two massive boulders that was barely wide enough for them to fit. They pressed themselves into the darkness, their breathing ragged, their hearts pounding so hard James could feel the pulse points in his neck threatening to explode. The sound of wings moved across the canyon entrance, hovering, searching. James kept his hand over Harper's mouth, not to silence her, but to keep her from screaming when the thing passed over their hiding place. It passed over, twice, 3 times. Each pass was deliberate, methodical, as if it knew they were here but was enjoying the hunt too much to end it immediately. Eventually, after what might have been 30 minutes or 3 hours, time had become meaningless. The sound of wings faded. The creature had moved on, back to its patrol, back to its claiming of territory. James and Harper emerged from their crevasse at approximately 300 hours. The moon had begun its descent. The darkness was absolute. The canyon was silent except for the wind and the water and the absence of anything else. They didn't speak. James used his radio sparingly. Brief contacts with dispatch, coordinates, requests for backup, all of it delivered in the clipped, professional tone of someone trying very hard not to let panic enter his voice. The hike back to the trailhead was a nightmare of slow progress through darkness, of jumping at every sound, of the constant awareness that they were moving through territory that belonged to something else now. The moonlight had abandoned them. James used his flashlight, and the beam created sharp shadows in the canyon that looked like movement, like wings, like the presence of a creature waiting in every shadow. They reached the trailhead at 05:30 hours, just as the first light was beginning to separate the eastern sky from the black. The moon had set. The sun had not yet risen. They were in the in-between, the threshold space where neither light source claimed dominion, and everything was the gray of approaching day. Harper was in shock, mobile but unresponsive, moving because James directed her to move, speaking only when directly addressed. Her equipment was still in the canyon, abandoned during the run. Her camp was still there. Her 3-day permit was now moot. James filed the incident report with dispatch as Harper sat in the ranger station, wrapped in a blanket that provided no comfort. His description of what they'd encountered was brief and non-specific. Large predatory bird, behavior uncharacteristic of known species. Attack response suggests possible habitat intrusion or territorial response. The official investigation that followed was necessarily inconclusive. A park ranger and a registered backcountry permit holder had reported hearing an unusual large bird in Water Canyon. The bird had behaved aggressively, but had not caused physical injury to either party. Park Service researchers examined the canyon for evidence, feathers, scat, territorial markers, and found nothing consistent with any known species. The incident was logged, filed, and forgotten by administration. Wildlife experts speculated about the possibility of an exceptionally large eagle, perhaps a golden eagle with unusual aggression, though the size estimates James had provided exceeded any documented eagle dimensions by significant margins. The case was closed, pending any additional reports. Harper Cole left the park that afternoon, driving back toward Fairbanks. She would not return to the Guadalupes, and her wildlife photography business would subsequently transition toward indoor studio work. The bat migration research she'd intended to conduct was abandoned entirely. James remained at the ranger station. He had nowhere else to go, and leaving felt like an admission of defeat. But he never returned to Water Canyon. He never worked that section of trail again. When other rangers covered those routes, James found administrative tasks that kept him at the station. At night, particularly on clear nights when the moon was bright and full, James would sometimes hear the sound of wings passing overhead. Too high to see, too swift to identify, but present enough that he knew it was real, and not a trick of exhausted nerves. He would stand outside the station and listen to the sound of those wings, moving over the land with territorial assurance. And he would understand that the creature had not forgotten him. The creature had merely decided to let him live, to let him continue existing in the park, aware of what owned that landscape, aware that his presence was tolerated only because the thing in the canyons had chosen tolerance. Years later, James would retire from the Park Service. He would move to a city in central Texas, hundreds of miles from any mountains or canyons. At night, he would sometimes wake to the sound of wings passing overhead, though the sky above Austin contained no creatures large enough to produce such sounds. The creature in the Guadalupe Mountains was still there, he knew. It was always there. It hunted in the canyons, claimed territory in the darkness, and marked its domain with symbols carved into the pale limestone walls, symbols that older hikers spoke of in quiet voices, symbols that newer rangers explained away as natural erosion patterns, symbols that everyone except James was too afraid to interpret correctly. The land had reclaimed itself. The wilderness had reasserted its ancient ownership. And the eyes that watched from the canyons, eyes that held intelligence and memory and a kind of patient, eternal hunger, continued their vigil over the country that had belonged to them long before the park was established, long before anyone had thought to call it Guadalupe Mountains or Freeholey Ridge or any of the other human names. Those eyes were always watching. They had simply decided to wait. Location: Congaree National Park, South Carolina. Date: March 31st, 2008. On the Congaree River had been rising for 4 days straight, and Marcus Webb knew the floodwater patterns well enough to understand what that meant. Heavy rains in the North Carolina mountains, the entire Congaree Basin becoming a vast, temporary lake, the park's boardwalk trails closing one by one as the water climbed the support posts. By late March, the park transitioned into what the rangers called the difficult season. Not winter, not fully spring, but a suspended moment where the wilderness reasserted dominance over human infrastructure and visitor convenience became secondary to ranger competence. Marcus had been with the National Park Service for 7 years, and he'd spent the last 3 of those managing Congaree's southeastern sector, a sprawling expanse of bottomland forest that transformed radically depending on the season and water level. In summer, it was a photographer's dream. Towering bald cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, clear waterways that allowed kayaking and canoeing, the distinctive calls of pileated woodpeckers echoing through the canopy. In spring flood season, it became something else entirely. The forest turned into a maze of water, fallen trees creating obstacles that hadn't existed weeks before, visibility reduced by the tannic stain of the river water, the very concept of trail becoming negotiable and subject to change without notice. The morning had started like most mornings at the ranger station, a small, cinder block building situated on higher ground about 2 miles from the main park entrance. Marcus had come in at 6, made coffee in the station's ancient coffee maker, and reviewed the overnight reports. 2 minor flooding incidents on the boardwalk loop, 1 fallen tree blocking access to the northern overlook trail, 1 call from a visitor who had gotten disoriented in the heavy fog and needed guidance back to the parking area. Nothing unusual for a spring flood event. The fog had been the first unusual element. It was thicker than normal, clingier, carrying a smell with it that made something in Marcus's hindbrain register as wrong. The Congaree in spring smelled like rich earth, decomposing vegetation, the mineral tang of floodwater. That smell was there, certainly, but underneath it was something else, something ancient and organic and vaguely like decay, the kind of smell that suggested things that had been underwater for a very long time, things that should have stayed buried, were now being disturbed and rising. By 8 in the morning, Marcus was out doing his first patrol. He'd taken the park's aging motorboat, the Cypress Runner, which was designed specifically for navigating the flooded forest. The boat was perhaps 20 feet long, with a shallow draft and a quiet electric motor that didn't disturb the wildlife. The river was swollen and moving with unusual force, the current pushing debris downstream. Entire trees, sections of wooden fencing from destroyed camps, what looked like someone's garden shed broken into pieces and distributed across the water's surface. He was checking the northern boundary when he received the radio call. Unit 3 dispatch. We have a missing person report. Solo female, Isabella Martinez, age 31, registered for a permit to do the boardwalk trail loop early this morning. Permit shows she checked in at the station around 6:30 a.m. Vehicle still in the lot. No one has seen her since. Park ranger stationed at the trailhead, Park Ranger Janet Corliss, last saw her heading onto the trail approximately 6:45 a.m. Ranger Corliss reported that she advised the visitor against hiking alone in the current conditions due to flooding and reduced visibility. Visitor elected to proceed anyway. Marcus keyed the radio. Dispatch, copy on missing person. I'm approximately 4 miles north of the trailhead. ETA to location 20 minutes. What do we know about the missing person? The response came back promptly. Isabella Martinez, female, age 31, Hispanic descent, dark hair, dark eyes, approximately 5'6", wearing a blue rain jacket and tan hiking pants, carrying a hydration backpack with water and a light lunch. Experienced hiker, her permit shows she's been hiking in the southeast for approximately 8 years. This is her 3rd visit to Congaree in the past 2 years. She's familiar with the park. That last detail made Marcus's concern escalate slightly. Familiar hikers who knew the trails well rarely went missing unless something had actively gone wrong. They weren't the ones who got disoriented and wandered off trail. They knew the map, knew the boardwalk system, knew where they were at all times. Marcus turned the Cypress runner around and accelerated toward the trailhead, keeping the electric motor as quiet as possible while still making decent speed. The fog was getting thicker, curling across the water's surface in patterns that seemed almost intentional, like something was directing it, pushing it in specific configurations. He reached the trailhead 20 minutes later. The boardwalk entrance was visible from the water, and the parking area was perhaps 50 feet distant. Marcus secured the boat and made his way to the ranger station where Ranger Janet Corliss was waiting. Janet had been with the park for 4 years, a competent and cautious ranger who took visitor safety seriously. If she had expressed concern about a solo hiker in the current conditions, that concern carried weight. She was adamant about going, Janet said immediately before Marcus could even ask. I told her the trail conditions were suboptimal. The water level is high, visibility is severely compromised, and I recommended she either wait for the water level to drop or pair up with another hiker. She said she'd been planning this hike for months, that she knew the trail, that she'd be fine. I filled out the permit, made note of her solo status, and logged her departure at 6:45. She was wearing bright colors and carrying a whistle. Everything by the book. How long before she was reported missing? About 40 minutes after she left, a group of 4 hikers came back saying they hadn't seen her anywhere on the trail. They'd been about 10 minutes behind her and figured they should have caught up given the reduced pace from the flood conditions. They didn't see anyone. No, Isabella. They mentioned it to me. I tried the radio to contact her, got no response. Called it in immediately. Marcus nodded, processing. The timeline was tight but not impossible. 40 minutes for something to go wrong, another 10 or 15 for the other hikers to realize she was missing and report it. The window between when Isabella had departed and when someone realized she was gone was roughly 1 hour. He looked at the trail entrance. The boardwalk was partially submerged, the first 50 yards visible, but the trail itself largely underwater. The water was brown, opaque, moving with a slow current that suggested the river was still rising. Visibility extended perhaps 30 feet before the fog completely obscured everything. I need to check the trail, Marcus said. Let me get my gear from the boat. 15 minutes later, he was moving along the boardwalk, one hand trailing on the wooden rail to keep his orientation in the fog. The water was cold, early spring temperature, carrying the chill of northern mountain snowmelt. His waterproof boots were keeping his feet dry, but his calves were soaked from mid-thigh down where the water was splashing over the boardwalk surface. The boardwalk trail was a flat, 1.5-mile circuit that had been built specifically to provide access to the bottomland forest without disturbing the ecosystem. It was designed for elderly visitors and families with children. No elevation gain, no technical difficulty, just a pleasant walk through the forest, except when the river flooded, at which point it became something else. The boardwalk was supposed to be elevated enough to stay above normal high water, but these weren't normal circumstances. The water was halfway up the wooden railings in places. Marcus moved slowly, listening. The forest was unusually quiet. There were always sounds in the congaree: birds, insects, the rustle of wildlife moving through the understory. Now there was just the sound of water lapping against wood, the occasional creak of the boardwalk settling under flood stress, and the soft sound of fog moving. About halfway along the trail, Marcus found Isabella's shoe. It was sitting on top of the boardwalk railing, placed there deliberately, not dropped or washed there by the current. The shoe was a tan hiking boot, relatively new, the laces tied neatly. It was one shoe, paired with nothing else, positioned as if someone had carefully removed it and placed it in a location where it would definitely be found. Marcus photographed the shoe with his camera before touching it. The boot was wet but not waterlogged. It hadn't been exposed to the floodwater for long. Hours at most. He checked the size. Women's size 7. The boot had a manufacturer's tag still inside. Isabella Martinez, 32808, written in permanent marker. The woman had labeled her own gear. He keyed the radio. Dispatch Unit 3. I've located personal evidence on the trail. One hiking boot. Confirmed to match the missing person's footwear. Location approximately 0.75 miles from the trailhead on the main boardwalk loop. I'm continuing the search, but this is now a higher priority SR situation. The response came back. Unit 3, copy on evidence. SR team is standing by. Continue search and advise. Vehicle is secure at trailhead. We're checking with local hospitals in case she was injured and walked out via alternate route. Marcus acknowledged and continued along the boardwalk. The fog was getting thicker, if such a thing was possible. His flashlight beams seemed to penetrate only about 10 feet now. The air had taken on a weight to it, a density that made breathing slightly difficult. He was listening so intently for any sound that might indicate human presence that he almost missed the voice calling from somewhere in the fog. Marcus. It was a woman's voice, not coming from ahead on the trail, not from behind, coming from the water itself, or perhaps from the forest beside the boardwalk. A woman's voice calling his name, with a quality to it that made Marcus's chest tighten involuntarily. He stopped walking. He knew that voice. He knew it absolutely, with a recognition that bypassed the logical part of his brain and went straight to the emotional core. It was his mother's voice. His mother, who had died of cancer 6 years ago, whose voice he couldn't quite remember with perfect clarity anymore, but which was absolutely unmistakably present here in this fog. Marcus, sweetheart, I'm so cold. Can you help me? Marcus turned toward the sound. The voice was coming from the flooded forest, from the area to the right of the boardwalk where the cypress trees rose from the dark water. It was his mother's voice, older, the way she had sounded at the end, when the disease had worn her down to a whisper. But it was definitely hers. Mom? He said. He didn't recognize himself speaking the word. I'm here, baby. I'm here in the cold water. I've been here for so long. Can you come find me? Can you come help me get out of the cold? Marcus was moving before his conscious mind could stop him. He stepped off the boardwalk into the water. The cold was immediate and shocking, driving the air from his lungs in a gasp. The water was deeper than it looked from the boardwalk, past his knees, climbing toward his thighs. The bottom was soft, yielding, as if it was made of decomposed vegetation, rather than firm earth. Keep talking, Marcus said. I'm coming. I'm so tired, Marcus. I've been here in the dark so long. The water is so cold. I need you to help me. I need you to remember what I taught you about the water, about the deep places. Do you remember? Marcus was moving deeper, pushing through the water, following the sound of his mother's voice. The fog was now complete. He couldn't see the boardwalk behind him anymore, couldn't see more than 3 or 4 feet in any direction. His flashlight was in his hand but seemed to do nothing but illuminate the immediate area around him. "I remember," he said, and he did. His mother had grown up in South Carolina, had taught him stories about the water, about the old creatures that lived in the deep places, about things that lived in the swamps and the bottomlands that weren't quite animals and weren't quite human. Stories meant to keep a child afraid of the water, respect the water, never go alone into the water. "That's good, Marcus, that's very good. You always were my smart boy. Can you come a little deeper, just a little? I need you to come where I am." The water was now above Marcus's waist, and his feet were no longer finding firm bottom. The current was pulling at him, a gentle pressure that suggested the floodwater was flowing with more force than it appeared. He was swimming now, more than wading, moving in what he hoped was the direction of his mother's voice. And then, abruptly, his hand touched something that wasn't water. It was soft and cold and shaped like a human body. Marcus flinched backward, his hand breaking contact immediately, and his flashlight swung toward the object. In the beam of light, he saw a woman's face, pale and bloated, her dark hair floating around her head like seaweed. Her eyes were open and glassy, her mouth slightly ajar. It was Isabella Martinez. Marcus screamed. He scrambled backward, his feet searching for purchase on bottom that wasn't there, his hands churning the water into foam. The body bobbed gently in the current, rotating slowly, and as it turned, Marcus saw that there was something wrong with her left side. Something had cut into her, leaving wounds that were far too regular to be natural. Wounds that looked as if they had been made by something with a knife, or a blade, or a claw that was sharp enough to cut through bone. The water around him began to move. It wasn't a current. It was something deliberate, something with intention. Something large was moving through the water, pushing it aside, creating waves that washed over Marcus's head and forced him to gasp for breath. He swam backward away from Isabella's body, away from whatever was in the water with him, his flashlight spinning wildly and illuminating nothing but fog and dark water. His mother's voice came again, but it wasn't exactly his mother's voice anymore. The inflection was wrong, the cadence slightly off, as if someone was playing a recording of his mother's voice at a speed that was fractionally different from normal. "Don't you want to see me, Marcus? Don't you want to help me? I've been waiting in the deep water for so very long. I've been collecting the lost ones, gathering them, learning their voices. Soon, I'll be able to call anyone down into the deep. Soon I'll be able to speak like they speak. Soon I'll be able to use their names the way they use names." Marcus reached the boardwalk and hauled himself up, his waterlogged clothes dripping, his breath coming in panicked gasps. He ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of him, his radio forgotten in his hands. Behind him, he heard the sound of something emerging from the water. Not a splash, more of a sound like wet fabric dragging across wood. Something was following him, something with a voice that could mimic human speech. He made it back to the trailhead and didn't stop running until he reached the ranger station where Janet was waiting. What Marcus couldn't comprehend, what his mind had already begun suppressing in the aftermath of that encounter, was that Isabella Martinez had been dead for hours before he'd found her in the water. The body had been positioned deliberately, placed in the exact spot where he would find it, where his panic would cause him to splash and flail and make noise that would attract attention. Because while Marcus had been waiting in the flooded forest trying to answer his mother's voice, Isabella had been somewhere else entirely. She had been sitting at the bottom of the old well, a structure that had existed since before the park was established, a relic of a homestead that had been reclaimed by the forest 100 years ago. The well was perhaps 20 feet deep, lined with stones that were slippery with algae and moss, and it had filled completely with floodwater. Isabella sat at the bottom, her lungs burning, her vision exploding with colors as her body tried desperately to continue breathing in the absence of air. She had been following a voice, a woman's voice that called her name, that promised her something, that lured her deeper and deeper into the flooded forest until she was so disoriented that she couldn't find the way back. And then the forest had opened up, and there was a well, and the voice had come from inside it. And Isabella had been so confused and so exhausted and so desperate to understand what was happening that she had climbed into the well without thinking. The climb down had been slippery and difficult. The climb back up had proven impossible. By the time Isabella realized her mistake, her feet had slipped on the algae, and she had plunged into the water below, and the cold, and the panic, and the absolute darkness of that place had taken over. She tried to scream, but screaming underwater just fills your lungs with water. She tried to climb, but the walls were too slippery and her hands had no purchase. She tried to touch bottom and push upward, but there was no bottom, just water extending down and down and down beyond any depth that made sense given the size of the well. And in the darkness, something moved. It was very old. It had been living in the water for longer than human beings had been living in South Carolina. It had learned the ways of predation through centuries of practice, had refined its techniques, had discovered that mimicry was more effective than force, that a human would follow the voice of someone they loved more willingly than they would follow any logical instruction to flee. It had once been hunted as a woman. The Cherokee called it Spearfinger. The name was literal. The creature had one finger, the index finger on its right hand, that had calcified and sharpened into something like stone, like obsidian, into a blade that could cut through flesh and bone with ease. It had used that finger for 5 centuries to mark its victims, to leave wounds that couldn't be explained by any animal attack, to feed on the lonely and the lost, and the people who ventured into the water places without the proper fear. It had learned human voices by eating the people who had them. It had learned Marcus's mother's voice because Marcus's mother had drowned in a flooded river in 1983, and the creature had been there at the bottom of that river, waiting, hungry, patient. It had absorbed her voice through the act of consuming her, had stored it in whatever passed for memory in a thing so ancient and so hungry. It had learned Isabella's voice over the past hour, as Isabella had slowly drowned. And when Marcus came to the well, drawn by promises in his mother's voice, drawn by the power of grief and love and the desperate human need to save someone we think we've lost, the creature would have a new voice to add to its collection. It would learn to call other names. It would wait in other parks and other wild places where the water was deep and the people were isolated. It would call the names of the dead to the living, and the living would come, drawn by love and the terrible human hope that maybe, just maybe, the people we've lost might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found. The search operation for Isabella Martinez was suspended after 3 weeks. The official cause of death, when her body was recovered by divers 2 days after the discovery, was listed as accidental drowning in flood conditions. The ranger report noted that she had ventured off the marked boardwalk trail into dangerous terrain, had become disoriented, and had fallen into deep water. The exact location where she had gone into the water was never determined, but the coroner noted unusual lacerations on her left side that were theorized to have been caused by pieces of sharp driftwood or submerged debris. Marcus Summers took a leave of absence from the National Park Service. He returned to his apartment in Columbia and spent 3 weeks seeing a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma and grief. He had experienced something in the floodwater, some kind of dissociative episode, some manifestation of trauma related to his mother's death. The psychiatrist was kind and professional and clearly had no context for what Marcus was actually describing. Marcus didn't try to make her understand. He knew that what he'd experienced had been real. He knew that the voice he'd heard was not a manifestation of his own mind. He knew that something in the congaree had called him by his name using his dead mother's voice. He also knew that that something was still there. When the leave of absence ended, Marcus requested a transfer to a completely different region. He wanted mountains, not swamps. He wanted dry land, not water. He wanted to work at a park where there were no rivers that rose in spring, no deep places where old things could hide. His transfer request was approved, and Marcus was assigned to Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. He told himself that he was being logical, that he was making a reasonable decision to avoid a traumatic location. But what he was actually doing was running from the thing that lived in the congaree. And as all who run from predators eventually learn, running only convinces the predator that you are prey worth hunting. On the evening of his final day at Congaree, Marcus sat by the river as the sun set, watching the water flow past, listening to the sounds of the forest settling in for the night. The water was lower now. The flood had receded, The boardwalk trail was no longer partially submerged. And then, carried on the evening breeze, he heard a voice calling from the forest. His mother's voice. His father's voice. The voice of his grandmother. The voice of Isabella Martinez, drowned and cold and speaking from a place where the sun never reached. From a depth beyond depth. All of them calling his name. Marcus didn't answer. He walked back to his truck. He packed his remaining belongings. He drove away from the congaree without looking back, the voices following him down the dark highway, becoming fainter, but never quite disappearing entirely. And in the water, the thing called Spearfinger settled back down into the deep places, into the wells and the channels where the current flowed, into the darkness where it waited. It had new voices now, new names to call, new people to lure deeper into the water. The creature was patient. Time meant nothing to something so old. It could wait years between meals. It could wait for Marcus Summers to get comfortable at his new posting, to lower his guard, to let the memory of what happened in the congaree fade to something that almost felt like a dream. And then, on some spring night when Marcus was walking through a mountain stream in his new park, it would call to him using a voice he loved. It would call to him using the names of people who had drowned in waters miles and miles away, people whose voices it had consumed and learned and stored like a predator storing food for winter. The deep water remembers, and the old things that live in the deep places have learned the power of human language. They have learned to call the living down into the dark where their prey belongs, where the water is cold and the pressure is absolute, where voices echo eternally in the drowning dark, never quite ending, never quite dying. Location: Gates of the Arctic National Park, Alaska. Date: January 23, 2006. The cold in January at Gates of the Arctic was a living entity, not just the absence of heat, but an active, aggressive force that attacked from every direction. It came through your clothes, through your skin, through the gaps in your defenses. It made your lungs burn when you breathed too deeply. It turned sweat into ice crystals before they could even form properly. Andrew Mercer had been the primary ranger at the Wiseman Station for 3 years, long enough to understand that January wasn't really part of winter. It was something harsher, something that existed at the boundary between regular seasonal cold and actual survival horror. The sun rose at 10:47 a.m. and set at 3:42 p.m., giving Andrew roughly 4 hours of actual daylight to work with. The rest was twilight, a gray perpetual dusk that made it impossible to accurately judge time or distance. Everything looked the same. Everything was white or gray or the absolute black of shadow. The landscape itself became almost abstract in this light. Mountains that might be miles away or 100 meters distant. Snow that might be a meter deep or 30 meters deep. Ice that might be solid or treacherous. Andrew's morning routine in January was compressed into the brief window of daylight. He was up before dawn, which was meaningless in Alaska in winter since dawn came whenever it came, and had coffee ready in the ranger station by 8 a.m. The coffee never cooled much below drinking temperature because the building itself was cold. The heating system worked, but the cold outside was so intense that it created a perpetual battle between inside and outside, with the ranger station existing in a state of fragile equilibrium that could be destroyed by something as simple as a door left open for too long. He checked the weather radio. 28 degrees Fahrenheit, wind from the north at 15 miles per hour, gusting to 25. Wind chill somewhere around 45. No new snow in the forecast, but the old snow was consolidated and dangerous. The kind of conditions that could trigger avalanche activity without warning. The park itself was essentially closed in January. No hiking, no camping, no visitors unless they were exceptionally experienced and armed with the permits that the Park Service required for extreme condition access. Andrew reviewed the visitor log. There was one permit holder currently in the park, a woman named Lily Morrison, age 28, supposedly an experienced backcountry hiker, who checked in 3 days ago for a 5-day solo expedition to the Hall Road area. She was due back today. Her checkout time was scheduled for 4 p.m., which meant Andrew had roughly 6 hours to prepare for her return or to begin a search if she didn't show up. The breakfast he made was routine: oatmeal, powdered eggs, coffee. high-calorie foods that would maintain body temperature in case he needed to go out into the field. He ate slowly, methodically, making sure his body had fuel before the day's work began. By 9:30 a.m., Andrew was dressed in his extreme cold gear: insulated parka rated for 60 degrees, thermal underwear, insulated pants, thick socks, boots rated for Arctic conditions, heavy gloves, balaclava, goggles. He looked like a figure from a different world, barely human, layered in technological protection against an environment that wanted him dead. The ranger station sat at elevation, overlooking a vast landscape of glaciated valleys and frozen water. The view was spectacular even in January, especially in January, when the minimal light created drama in every shadow and highlight. The mountains rose in sharp relief against the pale sky. The lakes and streams that were liquid in summer lay frozen, their surfaces smooth in some places and broken in others, where ice pressure had created ridges and pressure formations. By 10 a.m., Andrew was conducting his standard pre-daylight routine. He checked the emergency equipment in his truck: extra blankets, a small heating unit, flares, a satellite communicator for locations where regular radio didn't work, climbing gear, avalanche probe, shovel. He tested the radio. Good signal to the Fairbanks district office. He was as prepared as he could be for whatever the day might bring. The daylight portion of January was compressed and precious. By 11 a.m., Andrew was out on patrol, checking the routes that visitors might take. The Hall Road area where Lily Morrison was supposed to be hiking was accessible via a winter route that required significant experience and proper equipment. It was beautiful terrain, dramatic valleys, pristine alpine meadows. But in January, it was genuinely dangerous. Avalanches happened without warning. People could become disoriented in the limited light. Hypothermia could kill someone in under an hour if they became immobilized. Andrew drove the access road slowly, checking for any sign that Lily might have returned early or run into trouble getting out. The road was clear. The few shelters built along the winter routes were sealed and undisturbed. Nothing indicated distress. By 2 p.m., Andrew was back at the station. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. The twilight period would soon begin, that in-between time when navigation became exponentially harder. Lily Morrison was due to check out by 4 p.m. It was now 2:47 p.m., and she hadn't appeared. Andrew keyed his radio. Wiseman Station to Fairbanks District. I have a potential overdue visitor situation developing. Female visitor Lily Morrison was issued a permit for the Hall Road area, due to check out at 16 hours. No sign of her yet. Monitoring situation. The response came back clear. Copy, Wiseman Station. What's her experience level? Permit application indicated moderate to high backcountry experience. This is her first solo trip to gates of the Arctic. I issued the permit because her references checked out. Understood. Keep monitoring. If she's not back by 16:30, initiate search protocols. Conditions are going to degrade as the light goes. You'll have limited visibility soon. Copy, Fairbanks. We'll advise at 16:30. Andrew set the radio down and looked out the window at the landscape. The sun was already low on the horizon, and the light was taking on that particular quality of end-of-day cold. Everything seemed to be crystallizing. The air itself looked harder, and somewhere out in that landscape, a woman who had paid for the privilege of experiencing one of the most remote and dangerous parks in the country was either running late, injured, or in serious trouble. Lily Morrison had been hiking for 6 years, ever since a divorce had pushed her toward seeking meaning in solitude and stone. The gates of the Arctic permit had been a dream, the most remote major park in the country, genuine wilderness, genuine danger. She'd prepared meticulously, spent months training for altitude and cold, studied maps obsessively, researched equipment, talked to other hikers who'd done January trips to the park. What she hadn't adequately prepared for was how different the reality would be from the expectation. The first day had been manageable. She'd hiked the Hall Road area, established a camp in a sheltered location, managed the cold with the right equipment and protocols. The second day had been harder. Her body was already exhausted from fighting the cold, from hiking at altitude while breathing air so cold it hurt her lungs. The third day, today, she decided to take a shorter route back, to move toward the pickup point, to finish her expedition. The problem was that the landscape had become unreliable. Lily had been following what she was certain was the correct path back to the ranger station access point. The map was clear. The terrain should have been straightforward. But something about the way the light was falling, the way the snow and ice created visual confusion, had sent her in a direction that felt increasingly wrong. She'd stopped at 1:30 p.m. to check her GPS. The device had given her coordinates that didn't match the map. She'd recalibrated, checked again. Same result, impossible coordinates. Lily had continued anyway. GPS devices sometimes had errors in extreme cold, but doubt had entered her mind now, and doubt in the Alaskan wilderness was dangerous. By 2 p.m., she'd realized she'd been hiking in a circle. She could see her own previous footprints in the snow, places she'd walked earlier, landmarks she'd already passed. Lily wasn't lost exactly, but she was experiencing that particular form of disorientation that extreme cold could create, where your mind wasn't functioning quite right, where your sense of direction became unreliable, where the landscape seemed to rearrange itself when you weren't looking directly at it. She decided to make camp and wait for daylight to return, which was a sound decision, except that daylight was nearly gone. She had maybe 2 hours before the twilight period made navigation impossible, and she was several kilometers from the nearest shelter. Lily found a location that was as sheltered as possible and set up her emergency bivouac. She'd brought the right equipment for this possibility, an emergency shelter that could be assembled quickly, sleeping bag rated for 30 degrees, chemical hand warmers, high-calorie food supplies. She wasn't in immediate danger. She was uncomfortable, isolated, and dealing with the psychological challenge of being lost in the Alaskan winter. But she was trained for this. She could survive the night. It was around 2:45 p.m., as she was assembling the shelter, that she heard the voice. "Lily?" She turned immediately. The voice had come from somewhere to her left, across a snowfield that she could see clearly in the remaining light. There was no one there, just snow, ice, and the darker shadows of rock outcropping in the distance. "Hello," Lily called back. Her voice sounded small in the vast landscape, inadequate somehow. "Lily, it's Andrew, the ranger. I came to find you." Lily's first reaction was relief, then confusion, then something closer to unease. She'd only met Andrew Mercer once, at the ranger station when she'd picked up her permit, and he'd said nothing about looking for her, nothing about coming out to the Hall Road area. Also, he wouldn't be calling from across an empty snowfield. That didn't make sense. "Where are you?" Lily called back. "Over here, by the rocks. You need to come this way." The voice seemed to be coming from different places now, first from the left, then from the right, then from somewhere ahead. Lily's unease ratcheted up into something closer to alarm. She knew the dangers of the Alaskan wilderness. She knew that disorientation was one of them. She knew that hypothermia could cause hallucinations and psychological impairment. But she also knew that the voice sounded exactly like Andrew Mercer. Not close enough for her to see him, but close enough that she could hear him clearly. "I can't see you," Lily called back. "I'm going to stay here and wait for proper daylight to navigate." The response came immediately. "No, you need to come now. A storm is coming in. Bad one. We need to get you to the shelter before it hits." That sounded plausible. Storms did come in without warning. The forecast had mentioned possible weather degradation, but Lily's instincts were sending alarms now. Something about this wasn't right. "The forecast said clear weather until tomorrow," she called back. There was a pause. Then, "It's changed. Lily, I'm serious. You need to come now. There's a cabin maybe 2 kilometers north. We can reach it before dark." 2 kilometers north. Lily looked at her map. There was no cabin 2 kilometers north. There was exposed terrain, frozen streams, and rock. But the voice sounded so reasonable, so familiar, so like an actual ranger who understood the situation. "I'm staying here," Lily called back firmly. "I have shelter and supplies. I'm safe. You can find me in the morning when there's better light." Another pause. Longer this time. When the voice came again, it had changed slightly. The friendly, helpful tone had shifted into something else, something that sounded less like Andrew Mercer and more like the landscape itself, like wind given voice. "You have to come," it said. And now the voice was coming from everywhere, from the rocks to her left, from the snow to her right, from the sky above. "You have to come to the water." Lily's instinct overrode her training. She grabbed the unassembled shelter components and her pack and started walking, not toward the voice but directly away from it, toward the direction that she calculated would lead back toward the ranger station area. She didn't run because running in extreme cold was dangerous. It would cause overheating, hypothermia, the collapse of whatever thermal regulation her body had managed to establish. But she walked fast, and she didn't look back. Andrew was preparing the search equipment when the radio came to life. His watch showed 4:03 p.m. Lily Morrison was 3 minutes past her checkout time. "Wiseman Station, we have a situation," he said into the radio. "Visitor hasn't returned. Initiating search." "Copy, Wiseman. Be advised, Weather Service is predicting possible system movement into your area within the next 6 to 8 hours. Conditions are going to degrade. Do you want to wait for daylight or initiate tonight?" Andrew looked out at the landscape. The light was already nearly gone. The sun had dropped below the horizon, and the twilight period had begun. The landscape was transforming from distinct geography into vague shapes and shadows. Searching in this light would be difficult and potentially dangerous. But a night in January at gates of the Arctic with inadequate shelter could easily become fatal. "Initiating now," Andrew said. "I'll follow her proposed route and see if I can locate her before full darkness. If I don't find her by 17, I'll establish a search grid and resume at first light." "Copy, Wiseman. Stay in radio contact. We'll have SAR teams ready if needed." Andrew loaded his search gear into the truck and drove to the trailhead, where Lily would have begun her hike. Her vehicle was there, a rental SUV stuck in the parking area because roads in January weren't something you drove casually. He noted her license plate, her vehicle description, and keyed the radio with the information. Then Andrew began to follow her path into the wilderness. The hike was cold and demanding. Even with all his experience and equipment, Andrew felt the cold attacking constantly, finding the gaps in his gear, testing his thermal regulation, threatening hypothermia with every breath. He had a headlamp on now, because the light had faded to almost nothing. The landscape around him was defined only by the beam of his lamp and the faint starlight and moon that filtered through the clouds. He found her first campsite around 4:50 p.m. The location was good, sheltered, defensible, but there was no Lily. There was evidence of recent habitation, a place where she'd apparently rested and then moved on. Andrew checked the direction of her departure and continued following. The search had gone on for maybe 30 minutes when he heard it. A voice, calling his name. "Andrew! Andrew, I'm over here. I found shelter." Andrew stopped walking. The voice had come from somewhere ahead of him, maybe 200 meters away. It sounded like a woman's voice. It sounded like someone in distress. But something about it created an immediate moment of pause in Andrew's decision-making process. Something about it wasn't quite right. "Where are you?" he called back. "I'm coming. Keep talking." "By the water. There's a frozen lake just north of here. I found a shelter." Andrew's training sent up immediate warnings. There were no major lakes in that direction according to his map. There were frozen streams but not lakes, and Lily would know that from studying the maps the same way Andrew had. "Identify yourself," Andrew called back, even though that seemed absurd. "What's your ranger station name?" There was a pause. Then, "Andrew, don't be stupid. It's Lily. I'm cold. I need help." That could be true. Hypothermia could make people confused, disoriented, unable to remember basic information. But Andrew's gut was screaming something else. He keyed his radio. "Fairbanks. I have a voice contact in the search area, female voice claiming to be the missing visitor. But something's off about the contact. Continuing approach with caution." "Copy, Wiseman. Advise of any developments." Andrew moved forward carefully now. The light from his headlamp caught snow and ice and rock. He was heading roughly north toward where the voice seemed to be emanating. And as he got closer, other details began to register. The temperature had dropped even further. His thermometer on his parka was reading 32 degrees now. That was extreme even for gates of the Arctic in January. And there was a smell. Andrew's nose, protected by his balaclava, could still detect something. An organic smell that didn't belong in this frozen landscape. A smell like water, like algae, like something alive in an environment where nothing should be alive. "Andrew," the voice again, much closer now. "Andrew, I'm here, at the edge of the lake." Andrew crested a small rise and saw the water. It was impossible, but it was there. A frozen lake approximately 100 meters across, its surface solid white with ice and frost. And in the middle of the frozen surface, a hole, a perfectly circular opening in the ice, perhaps 5 meters in diameter, with dark water visible in its depths. And standing at the edge of that hole was a figure. For a moment, Andrew's mind processed it as Lily Morrison. The figure was roughly the right size, roughly the right shape. It wore hiking clothes similar to what Lily would be wearing. But as Andrew's headlamp caught it more clearly, details began to register that didn't match. The proportions were slightly off. The way the figure moved was slightly wrong, too fluid, too smooth, like it was operating according to physical laws that weren't quite standard. And the face, when the figure turned to look at Andrew, was not Lily Morrison's face. It was Lily Morrison's face imposed over something else, like a photograph copied onto material that was slightly translucent. Andrew could see Lily's features, her dark hair, her pale skin, her specific facial geometry. But underneath it was something different. Something that didn't have a human bone structure. Something that had eyes that were too large and positioned slightly wrong. Something that moved in ways that suggested entirely different musculature. "Andrew," it said, and the voice was Lily's voice, but with undertones that Lily could never produce. "Andrew, come to the water. Come see what I found." Andrew stepped backward. He didn't make a conscious decision to retreat. His body just moved that way, the most basic survival instinct overriding everything else. "What are you?" he demanded, his hand moving toward the hunting knife at his belt. The thing that wore Lily's face, or wore something that approximated Lily's face, smiled. And that smile was the wrong shape. "I'm Lily," it said. "I came to the water and I found something beautiful. I want to show you. Come close." Andrew kept backing up. "You're not Lily. Lily is lost somewhere in this park and you're... What are you?" The creature moved with that too smooth motion, stepping closer to the hole in the ice. And as it moved, Andrew could see that it wasn't actually walking on the ice. Its feet weren't touching the surface. It was moving through the air just above the frozen lake, suspended, defying gravity with a casualness that suggested the laws of physics didn't apply to it the same way they applied to humans. "Lily came to the water," the thing said. Its voice was becoming less like Lily's and more like something else. Something that sounded like water flowing over stone, like ice under pressure, like the sound of cold itself if cold had a voice. Lily understood. The water is alive. The water is patient. The water has been waiting for a very long time, and now Lily is part of the water. It gestured toward the hole, and Andrew understood with an absolute clarity that he didn't want to understand. The hole in the ice wasn't a natural opening. It was a mouth. The thing standing above it, or partially inside it, was only approximately lily-shaped. The deeper parts of it extended down into the water, into depths that Andrew's mind refused to fully process. "No," Andrew said. "That's not... Lily's somewhere here. She's alive. I'll find her." The thing that had been Lily laughed. The sound was like ice cracking. "Lily is here. Lily is everywhere. Lily is in the water. Lily is learning what the water knows. And you..." It pointed at Andrew with an appendage that wasn't quite an arm. "You should come too. You should learn. The water has been waiting for the water walker to understand." Andrew ran. He didn't think about it. He didn't plan it. He just turned and ran back the way he'd come, his headlamp bouncing wildly. his breathing becoming ragged despite the cold. Behind him, he heard the creature make a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a shriek, a sound that held dimensions of emotion that Andrew wasn't sure actually existed. Andrew didn't stop running until he reached his truck. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely turn the key in the ignition. The engine caught, and he sat with the truck running, the heat beginning to build as he tried to force his mind to process what he'd just seen. The Tlingit people had stories. Andrew had read them once in an old Park Service document about indigenous knowledge and park management. Stories about creatures in the water, kushtaka, ottermen, things that lived in the water and could take human form, things that lured people to the water, things that were ancient and patient and territorial. Andrew had dismissed it as folklore. The Park Service was big on incorporating indigenous knowledge, but most of that was practical. Seasonal patterns, wildlife behavior, sustainable harvesting. The supernatural elements were just stories, culture, tradition, local color. Now Andrew was beginning to think that maybe the indigenous peoples had been describing something real, something that had adapted to the presence of humans, something that had learned to mimic voices, to create the appearance of rescue, to lure hikers to the water where it could claim them. Andrew keyed the radio with shaking hands. "Fairbanks, this is Wiseman Station. I am abandoning the search. Missing hiker location is not safe for ground personnel. Requesting coordination with search and rescue for morning operations." "Copy, Wiseman. What's your status? You sound distressed." "I'm fine," Andrew lied. "But the location where the visitor's last signal was coming from presented hazards I couldn't safely navigate in the dark. Recommending SAR take the lead with daylight operations." "Understood, Wiseman. We're mobilizing SAR now. They can be there by early morning. Sit tight, and Andrew, you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," Andrew said again. "Just cold." He drove back to the ranger station and sat in the truck for a long time before going inside. When he finally did, he poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, which he normally never did while on duty, and sat in the dark, staring out at the landscape. Lily Morrison was never found. The SAR team searched extensively when they arrived. They found nothing. No body, no equipment, no sign of distress. The official report classified her as missing and presumed deceased, with the cause of death undetermined. Andrew requested a transfer out of Gates of the Arctic. The request was denied. Budget constraints, staffing shortages, essential personnel. He remained at Wiseman Station, but Andrew never hiked into the Hall Road area again, and he made certain that all visitor permits included explicit warnings about the dangers of the frozen lakes, about the risk of ice failure, about the hazards of traveling near water in January. Most of the warnings were standard. They appeared on all permits, but Andrew added some of his own. He required all solo hikers to file detailed daily check-ins. He implemented maximum stay limits that didn't allow people to camp near major water sources. Sometimes, on the darkest nights in January, Andrew's radio crackles with a voice that sounds like Lily Morrison. It asks for help. It says it found shelter. It calls his name with something that sounds almost like longing. And Andrew sits in the ranger station, listening, his hand on the radio key, but he never responds. The water at Gates of the Arctic is frozen most of the year. But underneath the ice in the dark depths, something waits, something ancient, something patient, something that learned a long time ago that if you want to catch water walkers, humans who are foolish enough to travel on foot in the frozen world, you just have to imitate their hope. You have to sound like rescue. You have to promise shelter and safety and the end of suffering. And sometimes, inevitably, someone believes you.